Wouldn't it be cool if there was a free course about digital strategy available on YouTube? Well, now there is one. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world define their digital strategies and execute their digital transformations. And one of the biggest, most interesting areas of digital transformation is digital strategy. Not only is it interesting, but it's also arguably the most important phase of a digital transformation. When you define your digital strategy, this is when you are defining what the roadmap is. This is what becomes oftentimes the Bible or the playbook for how you're going to execute your digital transformation. In other words, if you have a poor digital strategy, you're probably going to have a poor digital transformation. If your digital strategy isn't clear, your digital transformation is probably not going to be clear, and neither are the people on the project team. If your digital strategy is incomplete, your digital transformation is going to be incomplete as well. And last but not least, if you don't have a realistic digital strategy that takes reality into account, then you're going to end up with a digital transformation plan that doesn't make any sense and is unachievable. So there's a whole host of reasons why digital strategy is so important. But what exactly does it mean? That's where a lot of people get stuck, is just understanding what digital strategy is. And so what I want to do in today's training course is talk about not only what digital strategy is, starting with just the basics of what a digital transformation is. Then we'll get into a work stream and methodology you can use for your digital strategy. We'll get into some of the steps you can follow to define your digital strategy and roadmap. And then at the end of the video, we're also going to dive into some use cases and situational examples of how you can define the right digital strategy to fit your organization. And then at the very end of the video, we're going to do a keynote presentation. It's about a 40-minute presentation where I tie together all the things we talk about in this training session and put it back to you in sort of a summary presentation keynote format. So with all that being said, let's dive into the training. First, it helps to understand what digital transformation is. It's a big buzzword that's used commonly, but a lot of times there's no meaning behind it. So what I want to do in this first segment is just briefly talk about what digital transformation is, how to think about digital transformation, and how to apply that concept in a way that fits your organization. And when I first heard the term digital transformation many years ago, I really disliked the term. It didn't make sense to me. I actually grew up with my parents working at Digital Equipment Corporation back in the 80s, and that company is no longer. It's obsolete now. And so when I hear the term digital, I always thought it sounded a bit outdated. But nevertheless, digital transformation became a big buzzword. It's a commonly used term these days. It's one that, quite frankly, is overused, and it fills in the blanks or tries to fill in the blanks in a lot of different ways, in a lot of ways that it shouldn't be used. So what I want to do today is talk about what exactly is digital transformation, and most importantly, what does it mean to you and your organization. So first, it helps to provide a real simple overview definition of digital transformation. And in its most simplest terms, digital transformation is the use of technology, any sort of technology, that helps improve your business. And that could be enterprise resource planning software, for example, ERP systems. It could be customer relationship management software to help manage your sales force. It could be financial and accounting software. It could be technology to automate your shop floor if you're a manufacturing organization. It could be robotics. It could be Internet of Things. It could be blockchain. It could be artificial intelligence. And again, I know I'm rattling off a bunch of buzzwords and a bunch of technologies that you may or may not understand, but the key point here is that digital transformation is any sort of technology that enables your business and allows you to be more productive, more efficient, and more effective. So I don't have an exact definition of when digital transformation began. It was a very organic evolution of technology and its use in businesses and organizations. But really, you can trace a lot of this back to the 80s and 90s when businesses were first starting to use spreadsheets and word processors and other types of rudimentary technology that's very basic today. And over the years, what ended up happening, particularly in the 90s, there was a big revolution of enterprise software that went beyond spreadsheets and word processing that allowed companies to track orders and to track information and financials, track sales information, that sort of thing. And it really evolved into what is now known as ERP. And it started off as material resource planning in many cases for manufacturing organizations that were just trying to track their inventory and their manufacturing operations, which then evolved into enterprise resource planning, or ERP, as I mentioned. And at the same time, a lot of organizations were starting to implement more robust accounting and financial software. So back in the 80s and 90s is where you can really trace that evolution of digital transformation. And in my opinion, what's happened in the 2010s is that a lot of new technologies have exploded onto the scene. A lot of technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, Internet of Things, a lot of things you may have heard of, a lot of things you may not have heard of, but these are a lot of revolutionary technologies that allow businesses to operate better and more effectively. So the term digital transformation has become sort of a catch-all bucket for a lot of these technologies. And there is no one definition of what digital transformation means to any given organization. For some, it could be just implementing an ERP system. For others, it could be implementing a financial system. For others, it could be implementing robotics on the shop floor. Whatever the case may be, it's a matter of defining what digital transformation is to you. But before we do that, it's helpful to look at that history of how digital transformation came to be. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret, and that is that digital transformation really doesn't have a lot to do with the digital part of the term, but it has a lot more to do with transformation and the second word in the term. And even though technology is a driver of some of these digital transformations, it's really at the end of the day more of a business transformation that organizations are trying to accomplish. Generally, they're trying to improve their efficiency, they're trying to provide a better customer experience to their customers, they're trying to be more effective as an organization, they're trying to make the jobs easier for their employees. So really it's driven by the business needs, and it just so happens that technology is one way to enable those changes. And so the key word here is transformation. That's the operative word within digital transformation. And in fact, I would argue that we can just scratch digital altogether and call it a business transformation. Digital is likely to be a big part of that business transformation, but there's a lot more to it than just the technology itself. There's also the process improvements, the process management, the process reengineering that needs to happen. And there's also the organizational change, or the people side of the equation that's going to change. So this is why business transformation is probably a more descriptive term in defining what exactly digital transformation is. It's more of a business transformation and help improve the business or the organization that you're working in. Now, despite all the new great technologies out there, a lot of digital transformations fail. In fact, more digital transformations fail than succeed. And it's not because the technology isn't there. It's not because the technology can't do certain things. It's not that we haven't made advancements in technology over the last few decades, but it's because we haven't addressed that business transformation side of things that I just managed. When we neglect the business process and or the organizational or people side of things, we're neglecting the entire digital transformation. And no matter how great the technology is, if we haven't addressed people and processes as well, and in fact, if we haven't addressed people and processes even better than we've invested in the technology, our likelihood of failure is very high. So digital transformations have a high failure rate. They're very painful for a lot of organizations. And for organizations that don't have a lot of experience with it, it can be overwhelming and they're not always sure what to do. So it's very important to recognize that digital transformations are only going to succeed when you invest heavily in the people and process side of things to correspond with the investments in technology. Now that we understand what digital transformation is, and before we get into all the details of what digital strategy is, I want to take a moment to talk about just 3 things that you need to know about digital strategy. And these aren't work streams or activities necessarily, but they're 3 outcomes that you should expect to see in your digital strategy. And if you achieve these 3 outcomes, you're highly likely to succeed in your transformation. And if you fail in any one or more of these 3 outcomes, you're probably going to fail in your project. So it's really important to understand where you are in these 3 things and make sure that your team understands how important these 3 things are. And we use an acronym here to describe these 3 things. Think of raising the bar and think of BAR as an acronym. And we want to raise the bar on our digital transformation. And to do so, we need to accomplish these 3 things, which are balance, alignment, and realism. When digital transformations fail, it usually doesn't have a lot to do with some sort of breakdown in the technology. Now, it could be that there are breakdowns in the technology. It could be that there's issues with configuration or customization or testing or data. That could be part of the problem, but ultimately what we find is that's usually not the root cause of the problem. Usually technical issues are a symptom of a deeper issue surrounding balance. And that's the first letter in the acronym for BAR. So as we look at balance, the B within BAR, we need to think about how we can balance our digital strategy. How do we focus our efforts and our resources on things beyond just technology? Historically, organizations would spend 80, maybe 90% of their time, focus, and money on technology, and they wonder why their digital transformations fail. Instead, what they should be doing is spending less money on technology and more money on the non-technical aspects of their implementations. Things like organizational change management, program management, taking time up front to do that phase 0 implementation plan. All those things are things that are likely to make your project succeed, and they're likely to address the root cause of why all these other symptoms happen around technical implementation issues. So think of this as a recipe. When you're developing your digital strategy, if you have too heavy of a dose of technology, it's going to taste bitter, it's not going to be edible, it's not going to be something you enjoy, and people are going to be left with a bad taste in their mouth, so to speak, throughout your organization. So that's why we really need to dial back the mix of focus on technology versus some of the other aspects of change management, program management, controls, process improvement, etc. And one general rule of thumb that doesn't apply to every organization, but I'd say it applies to most organizations, is that if you're spending more than 50% of your time, effort, and budget on technology, then something's wrong. You're probably not focused on the right things, and you're probably too focused on technology, which is just one part of the equation, and you don't want to neglect those other parts. So one of the biggest things you can do to ensure that you're successful is to ensure that you have balance in your overall digital strategy, to focus on non-technical aspects as much or more than you do on the technical aspects of the project. The next thing we need to do to raise the bar of our digital transformations is the A in the acronym BAR, which is alignment. How do we ensure that we are aligned from corporate objectives all the way down to end user adoption? And that's a big undertaking. There's a lot of different layers within that. It starts with ensuring that our digital strategy is aligned with our corporate strategy or our organizational strategy. We want to make sure that the digital strategy we pursue isn't misaligned with the objectives we're trying to accomplish as an organization. For example, if you're an organization that's looking to standardize business processes across all of your operations, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for you to pursue a best-of-breed solution where you have multiple systems for different parts of the organization, because that's just going to enable a digital strategy that's different from your corporate strategy. So you want to make sure you've got that alignment between corporate strategy, digital strategy, and you also need to make sure your executive steering committee is aligned too. Make sure that they all understand what the digital strategy is and what the different components of the digital strategy are. And again, that's something you would address during phase 0 before you get into the implementation, because those are where a lot of the key decisions are made that are going to set the trajectory of your project for better or for worse. Once your executive steering committee is aligned with the overall digital strategy and the corporate strategy, you need to make sure that your project team is aligned, as well as the end users and the frontline employees within the organization. And those latter two areas, the project team and especially end user adoption, those are related more to change management as far as how we ensure that the organization is aligned and understands why we're going through the project the way we are. And the way you align your project team with your executive steering committee is making sure that there's a tight connection between the project team and the steering committee, and also make sure that the project team understands the goals and objectives and priorities that's been set by the executive steering committee. Too often organizations assume that this is just a technology upgrade and they delegate the project to the project core team without giving clear direction on priorities and expectations and measures of success for the project. So we need to make sure we're fully on board on the same page across all levels of the organization, beginning with the overall corporate strategy all the way on down to the project team and frontline end user employees. The third and final aspect of raising the bar is the R in the acronym for BAR, which is realism. How do we create a realistic view of what this digital strategy is going to take to execute? And this is where a lot of organizations get stuck, and this is where a lot of failures begin. It's with having unrealistic expectations that a lot of companies make bad decisions later on. Just to give you a use case at a high level that typically happens, what happens more often than not is a software vendor comes in, gives you a proposal for what it's going to take to implement their technology. The management team draws a line in the sand and says, we're going to take that proposal at face value. We're going to take the vendor's proposed budget at face value, and that is going to be our plan for the project going forward. Now, this is a highly unrealistic view of what the overall digital transformation is really going to look like for a few different reasons. First is the software vendor typically will underestimate the overall implementation time and cost. Not because they're bad people or they're trying to deceive you, but because they don't understand what it's going to take to do more than just implement technology. Their goal and their job is to design and build technology. Your job is to transform your business, and those are two very different goals and objectives. So they're giving you just one part of the plan, and that's why typically they've underestimated the overall time and cost. The other reason why vendor proposals oftentimes lead to unrealistic expectations is because they're incomplete. It's only one work stream within an overall digital transformation. If you think of an overall program, typically you have the technology work stream, which is where your software vendors and your system integrators might get involved. You typically would have an organizational change work stream, a process improvement work stream. You typically would have a architecture and data integration work stream. And then you would typically have a program management layer that sits on top of the overall program. And so when you look at your proposal, you have to think of the context of you're just getting one piece of an overall program, and you've got to fill out the details of what the rest of the program is going to look like. Now, if you'd like to get some ideas on how to do this and how to differentiate between technical project management and overall program management, watch this video right here on my YouTube channel. I whiteboard and explain what program management is and how that's different from technical project management. That'll give you some ideas of how you might structure your team and your overall plan to reflect this level of realism that you need in your overall project. So this is why realism is so important. If you don't have a realistic plan, what ends up happening is you're forced into a bunch of bad decisions later in the project, because now you're trying to scale back and fit the project into an unrealistic project plan and budget, and it was never realistic to begin with. For example, a lot of times we see clients who will start to cut cycles of user acceptance testing, or they'll cut cycles of end user training. They'll cut back on change management because they think that they're going to save time and money by doing so, but actually what they're doing is increasing the time and cost of the overall project. And so you don't want to be in that position where you end up feeling like you have to make bad decisions or cut things that are going to be critical to your project. And so it's a lot easier to define a realistic budget and plan early on up front. So what does this mean as far as how we define our digital strategy? We've talked about raising the bar and how BAR stands for balance, alignment, and realism. But how do we do this? How do we ensure that we get our project team on the same page with recognizing the need to accomplish these three things? Well, probably the biggest thing you can do is invest in a phase zero implementation plan before you ever get started in your project. Ideally, you would do this even before you've evaluated and selected technology. But if you've already selected technologies, there's still a huge amount of value in doing this phase zero planning, because that's the point in which you dive into what the plan looks like. You dive into and validate and challenge the assumptions. You complete the project plan or the program plan to ensure you have all the different components within it. And you also make sure that your team is aligned. You make sure that the executives and the project team are aligned with the overall corporate strategy and vision. And it also gives you an avenue or a channel to create a change management strategy and plan that will ensure that the frontline end users will become and remain aligned with the overall project. Now that we understand the three major outcomes we should expect from our digital strategy in order to be successful with our digital transformation, we can now dive into a little bit more detail and look at what is the actual methodology and the framework you should be using to define your digital strategy. So in this next segment, I'm going to unpack the concept of digital strategy by sharing with you a methodology in a whiteboard format that walks through all the major components of the digital strategy and roadmap framework methodology that we use with our clients.
There's a lot more that goes into defining a successful digital strategy that goes well beyond technology. We need to look at the strategic implications, the operational side of things, the organizational side of things, as well as other components that are critical to making your digital transformation successful. So what I want to do today is unpack a digital strategy framework that we use with our clients to help organizations and project teams understand what the different things are that they should be considering and thinking about and addressing as part of the definition of their digital strategy. Now, before I get started, I encourage you to download two different resources I'm going to provide. One is, if you are interested in this visual that I'm about to go through with you here today, I've included my email address below, and you can actually email me. I'll send you these slides that I'm about to go through. Secondly, I encourage you to read my book that's called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations. This is a book that outlines some of the best practices from a strategic perspective as well as an implementation perspective in helping over 1,000 clients through their implementations in recent years. You can read that book by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or you can go to the links below to download this and other resources that I've provided for you. So when we're defining our digital strategy, there's a number of work streams that we need to think about. And the first one I'm going to talk about right now is business process management. This isn't necessarily the first thing that happens sequentially. As you can see, a lot of these things are going to happen in parallel, but this is the work stream I want to focus on to start, which is business process management. In order to define a digital strategy that makes the most sense for our organization, and one that's most aligned with where we are today and where we're headed in the future, one of the key things you need to do to accomplish that is to focus on your current state and your future state business processes. I'm not going to dive into how to do this, but for more information about business process best practices, there's a video I'm going to direct you to right here. If you click on this link right here, it's a link to a video about how to handle business process improvement, how to do business process mapping as part of your digital transformation. In that video, I go into a lot more detail about how to go about this and some of the nuances of defining your current state and future state. But for today's purposes, all I'll mention is that you want to make sure you start with the current state so you know where you're starting from and you understand the strengths and the weaknesses of where you are today, as well as the future state business processes that you would like to get out of your digital strategy. Once you've done these two activities, that's where you start to look at the potential business process improvements, and you might even start deploying some business process improvements in parallel with selecting and deploying technologies. In other words, you don't necessarily need to wait until you find new technology to implement all of your process improvements, even though many of them will be enabled by new technologies. There's certain incremental improvements you can make to your processes now to help you get immediate value and to help set you on the course to that future state in the meantime. And at the very least, it gives you a roadmap and a future state that you can build an entire transformation plan around after you've defined the differences and the delta between your current state and your future state. So business process management is a critical part of any sort of digital strategy that you might need to define. Now, the next work stream worth talking about as it relates to digital strategy is your organizational change management. A lot of times organizations erroneously think that change management is something we don't need to worry about until later. This is something we do once we pick the technology, once we start training people on technology, that's where we start to worry about the people side of things. That's a big mistake. Reason for that is because in order to understand what your digital strategy is, what the most effective digital strategy is going to be for your organization, you need to understand the current lay of the land organizationally. Who are you today culturally? What are the strengths and weaknesses of your culture? What do you want that culture to be in the future? And ultimately, what do you want your organization and your people to look like in the future? If we don't do that, then we don't really know what our digital strategy is, and we don't really know what our digital transformation is going to look like. We'll be guessing at best if we don't do that organizational change piece of it starting in the digital strategy phase. But we don't do everything related to change management up front. We just do the early stages of change management. And those early stages include organizational assessment. This is where you look at the culture and the strengths and weaknesses of your current state, and you start to identify what the potential pitfalls are that might hinder your progress in your digital transformation. You also begin to look at the organizational impact. What are those things that are going to change as a result of moving to the future state of business processes that you've defined up here? So far, as we go through this process, we're defining in parallel what the process improvements are. We're going to come down to enterprise applications here in a minute, but we're also starting to look at technologies and starting to get a better vision of what technology or technologies might be used to enable our transformation, which then in turn informs us on what our organizational impact is going to be. And again, we need to know how big of an impact we're talking. Are we talking this much change to our people or this much change? Depending on what that degree of change is, that's going to drive and determine what our overall digital strategy needs to look like and what our deployment plan needs to look like. And then finally, in the early digital strategy phase of a project, once we've done the organizational assessment and the organizational impact, now we can look at and build an organizational change plan that is specific to us and who we are and who we're trying to be as an organization. Now, there's a lot more I didn't cover here as it relates to change management. I could spend an entire video talking about change management. In fact, I have talked about change management in multiple videos. So I'm going to link a playlist right here. It's a playlist to an organizational change management series of videos that I have on my YouTube channel, in a great amount of detail that will help you understand what some of these activities are. But for the time being, these are some of the main activities that you want to start on from a change management perspective as you define your digital strategy. A third work stream that's running in parallel with business process management and with organizational change management is the enterprise applications work stream. And this is really the more technical, the more software-focused aspect of our digital strategy. And I think this is probably the one that's most intuitive, especially if you're a CIO or an IT person. This is the one that's very tangible. You can see it, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can contact vendors, start getting demos, and really start to get your hands on what technology could do for your business or what technology options are out there. So it's an important work stream, but it's not the only one as we're talking about here throughout this video. So the first thing that we do is we define our digital strategy. As we start to look at the software industry landscape, we look at what are our different major options. At this point, we're probably not going deep into a software evaluation or deep into a software selection, but instead what we're doing is defining our alternatives at a high level. For example, some alternatives include a tier 1 ERP system like SAP or Oracle, for example. That's one option. Another option might be a best-of-breed model where we go find a best-of-breed financial and accounting solution, a best-of-breed work management or warehouse management software, best-of-breed CRM or HCM software, just different types of technologies. Best-of-breed is one alternative. We could make the decision of whether we buy versus build, custom develop solutions, a lot of different options we have. So at this point, what we're doing is we're looking at high-level paths that we can take and high-level alternatives so that we can ultimately assess the pros and cons of each and determine which one is best aligned with our overall corporate or organizational strategy. So this is where we look at those strategic alternatives and the roadmaps. You look at what the different implementation timeframes are, the implementation budgets or the estimated budgets, the risk profiles, the potential business value and ROI. Again, we're looking really high level. We're not getting into demos yet. We're not talking to software vendors necessarily to do deep dive understandings of the software, but instead we're assessing the pros and cons of these different alternatives that we have at a high level. And then from there, this is where you start to look at a short list. This is where we start to narrow it from a long list to a short list to where we do identify what those specific alternatives are that we might dive into either as part of our digital strategy, or it could end up being a separate software evaluation and selection that happens after digital strategy. A lot of it just depends on where you are as an organization and how urgent you're moving as an organization. Once you've defined that short list, this is where you start to look at the technology recommendations and the implementation roadmap and plan. And again, when you get to this part right here, this is a part that you might push out to a separate software evaluation phase, especially if you're not certain that you're going to move forward with the digital transformation. It may be that you push this out until you know that you have alignment and approval for moving forward with the transformation. But more often than not, organizations define their recommendation or their suggested software along with an implementation timeline and cost as part of their digital strategy. So these are some of the major things you want to think about and evaluate as part of the technical enterprise application component of your digital strategy. Now next, another component of our digital strategy should be the solution architecture. How will our technical solutions that we've looked at here, how will these technical solutions fit into the overall architecture? And this is where we look at how we're going to integrate systems, how we're going to manage data, how we're going to handle business analytics, business intelligence, reporting, things of that nature. And it's a way for us to really lay out that technology roadmap. How are the various moving parts going to fit together into a cohesive technology roadmap and technology strategy within our digital transformation or our digital strategy? Now, a lot of organizations think, well, I don't need to really worry about this because I'm just going to go pick one ERP system. If you do that, if you're able to pull that off, you're one of a tiny fraction of organizations that can actually do that, because most organizations end up with multiple systems. Even if they want a single ERP system, they inevitably end up with some legacy systems or third-party bolt-ons that they have to maintain for regulatory purposes, or because the integrated ERP system won't do what they need it to do, so therefore they end up with other bolt-ons. Or even if you do end up with the single ERP system, integrated system, you're not going to implement it all at once. You're going to have to slowly decommission systems and move on to the new system. So for all those reasons, you need to have a clear technology roadmap that looks at solution architecture. So this is where you look at the current architecture, how the future state is going to look, what the impact is going to be, what sorts of technology initiatives and work streams and tasks you need to include in your detailed implementation plan that will come later. And then you have your recommended architecture, which includes your change plan and your cost from a technology perspective. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that when we're looking at current architecture, the architectural impact, and the future state recommended architecture, we're not just looking at physical architecture, we're also looking at IT skills. So we're looking at our IT department and looking at what skills do we have today? What's that infrastructure organizationally that we have to support a digital transformation and technology going forward? And what is it we would need going forward and what are the gaps. We can reskill our existing staff, we could hire existing staff, we could bring in a managed service provider to provide some of those competencies, or some hybrid or combination of all the above. So when we look at solution architecture, it's not just physical architecture, it's also looking at your organizational infrastructure and architecture as well. Now, a digital transformation is only as good and valuable as the information and the insights we get from new technologies and new processes. And that's why business intelligence and analytics is so important and why you should call it out as a separate work stream. Especially in today's day and age of artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and all these great tools that you can use to really leverage and harness the power of the data that you've accumulated as an organization over years and decades. For that reason, you want to really focus on business intelligence and analytics. So here's where we identify what our analytical requirements are. You start with your current state. What are the reports that we need to have to run our business today? And what's the information that we're missing? What are those reports that in a perfect world we would have insights and real-time visibility into, that sort of thing. So we really want to understand what those requirements are, and this is where we can get real creative and think quantum leap type improvements with AI, predictive analytics, and that sort of thing that'll help you have better business intelligence and analytics than you might have had in the past. You then want to define what your future state requirements are in terms of predictive analytics, data requirements, any sort of technology best practices, and then ultimately you want to define what your analytics roadmap is. What is it going to cost to leverage the BI capabilities of technologies you're deploying, or if there's a standalone BI or analytical tool set you're going to deploy as part of a transformation or in addition to the core technologies, you want to understand what that tool set looks like, what the costs are, the software requirements, and what the deployment plan is. So it's a little bit similar to this enterprise app workstream we talked about up here. These two are very similar, but here we're focused on the overall analytics and BI and reporting capabilities. Here you're talking about the core back office, core workflow-based technologies. But you generally want to call these out because oftentimes this part gets overlooked and we tend to myopically focus here and not focus enough on the BI and analytical reporting part of our digital transformation. Now, the last work stream that runs in parallel, starting here in digital strategy, and actually this work stream continues all the way through your transformation, or at least it should, and that is your project quality assurance. This is the risk mitigation framework, the project governance, the resourcing, the overall QA processes and frameworks that are going to help ensure that your project stays on track. And again, this is something that becomes very important as you get into the deeper implementation activities downstream, but it's also important even as you're getting started on the project. It's good to build this muscle memory to start to understand and establish this governance and the project charter and the quality assurance and the risk mitigation mechanisms. They're going to ensure that you keep this phase of the project on track, but even more importantly, it keeps future phases of the project on track as well. It also allows you to understand what this framework is going to look like as you get into the execution of the digital transformation, so you can create a plan and a project charter and a resource estimate that reflects the realities of what it is you're going to deploy from a quality assurance perspective. And this is something that you might want to rely on third-party, independent, technology-agnostic partners, companies like Third Stage Consulting, who do this all the time for a living and have seen hundreds or thousands of different implementations throughout the world. You can leverage people like us to provide that objective view of what sorts of governance are going to be most effective for you, and more importantly, identify and mitigate the risks that are likely to disrupt or derail the transformation if you don't get a good handle on it. So this is a deeper dive into what some of these different work streams are within a digital strategy framework, but it's also helpful to look at, without getting into too much detail, what happens next. What are those downstream activities that come right after a digital strategy project? And I want to just give you a preview of what happens next. So once you've defined your digital strategy and roadmap, now you start to define what is the detailed plan to get us ready and to get us prepared for a more detailed implementation. So this is the point right here. Imagine a little milestone right here. We've finished our digital strategy phase of the project, and now we're getting into implementation readiness. So now we take everything that we've done over here on the left side in our digital strategy engagement, all that stuff I just talked about. Now we get into implementation readiness. And you start to see a lot of the similar work streams here. You've got the operational side of things, which is the business process management from the previous slide. People readiness coincides with the organizational change piece. Technical readiness coincides with the enterprise applications and the business intelligence and the architecture pieces. And then, of course, project governance, planning, and quality assurance is an extension of that quality assurance work stream that I talked about before. So really the only new one here that we tend to focus on is strategic and executive alignment. And quite frankly, oftentimes the strategic and executive alignment starts in the digital strategy phase, but a lot of organizations will wait until they have a clearer roadmap to then start to define in more detail what the overall strategic and executive alignment looks like. So this is where we make sure that we've got our stakeholders and executives on board and aligned with what this project is going to be and how we're going to execute the strategy that we've defined in terms of the implementation. When we get into operational readiness, now we get deeper into the business processes. We define in more detail what the business requirements are. We start to get deeper into further flushing out what the business processes are. We're not getting down into the detail yet of defining business processes at the transactional level within the software, but we're starting to flush out more detail that defines, now that we know what the software is going to be or what the technologies are going to be, what are the different pieces of the business processes going to look like to support that technology implementation. And then people readiness too. Now that we've defined the organizational readiness and the organizational change plan during the digital strategy phase, now we start to get deeper into defining the change team. We start to identify the skills, competencies that we need to develop as an organization. We start to get into future state organizational and role design. We start to define transformation communications plan, the organizational design of what the future state organization is going to look like. And this is all really important stuff, especially if we're materially changing or restructuring our business as part of a digital transformation. If your goal is to standardize business processes and centralize certain functions within a global organization, for example, this piece right here is really important. And if we don't do this up front, by the way, if we push this out to implementation out here, what happens is the implementation ends up taking way too much time and money because now you're spinning your wheels trying to figure this stuff out at the same time you're trying to build and deploy technology. So the more we can do up front from an organizational perspective and from an operational perspective for that matter, the more we're going to save time and money later on down here. And then technical readiness too. This is where we start to get our ducks in a row with building out our IT organization, the architecture that we need, as well as the data management and mobilizing a center of excellence to help us take ownership and control of the implementation and not be too dependent on our technical implementers. So again, this whole phase that we're talking about here is step one following digital strategy, but before we get into implementation. And that's a way for us to allow ourselves to build that competency and build that in-house knowledge to be able to be more effective and to have more ownership of the project as we get into implementation. And then finally, project governance and planning. This is something that we start to build out in more detail here. We build out the project charter, the detailed project plan, the resourcing. We make sure that we've not only taken the technology work stream or the technology proposal from our software vendor, but now we've built it out into a more complete program. So we've got the technology work stream that's typically provided by our software vendor, but then we've got to round it out with all this other stuff to create a complete project plan, a complete project charter, and a complete governance approach and quality assurance approach to help make sure that the project is successful.
Now, in this last segment, we talked about the major components of digital strategy, the major work streams, and the methodology you should use to define your digital strategy. But now let's get a little bit more tactical and talk about the 10 steps to get started. And what we want to do here in this next segment is really take some of the conceptual comments we talked about in the previous segment and break those down into actionable steps that you can start executing now to move toward a more effective digital strategy. So I'm going to go through 10 quick steps here that talk about how to define a digital strategy, knowing that there's a lot of risk, knowing that failure rates are high, and knowing that there's no secret, there's no secrecy or luck involved with success versus failure. They're very common patterns, and these are extremely common. In fact, you can always look at these expert witness cases, these extreme expert witness cases, and it's always amazing to me how these massive failures look so similar. They made so many of the same mistakes, and just on an extreme level. And that's why when we define our strategy, we need to do so in a way that doesn't get rid of the risk, but it recognizes that there is risks, there's trade-offs, there's pros and cons, there's no perfect answer. But guess what? We're going to create a strategy and a roadmap that gets us on the same page and fits us as a business and isn't going to create that level of misalignment internally. So the first thing is to articulate an organizational strategy. And I included some screenshots. We'll share these slides with you, but there's screenshots you can see that it's really hard to read from where you're at right now. But one of the things we like to do is sort of a visual exercise with executives when we do these executive strategy sessions. we'll do visual exercises where we try to understand a number of decision criteria and parameters for what the transformation is going to look like. And for, one example that you'll see on here is common business processes, standardized business processes across the entire enterprise versus decentralized, independently operating companies. And there's a spectrum there, a continuum, right? So you're not one or the other. You're probably somewhere in between. But we just try to understand, where are you guys right now? Let's talk about that first. And what's amazing is oftentimes, even when you're assessing yourself right now, we can't get the same answer. We have different opinions. Different parts of the business might have a different answer. And so you look at different functions and locations, and they all have different perceptions. But we do this with the leadership team to see how well aligned are they. And oftentimes, even just starting with current state, they're not aligned. They don't see the world the same way as far as where they are today. They don't self-assess themselves the same way. And then when you start to look at, well, what about the future? What should we be doing in the next 5 years? Do we want to standardize, or do we want to operate independently? Then you typically see an even broader variation in those responses. And we do this visually to show, like, hey, this is, we're starting at the top here. You guys are not on the same page. And guess what? That's trickling down the entire organization if you're not aligned up here. So let's start at the top and get that alignment on where we are today and where we're going. And by the way, let's also understand and make sure that we're clear on what it is we're actually trying to do. So if we say, for example, we are going to move from completely decentralized and independent autonomy over here, and we're moving to a model where we're completely standardized and acting like one common company, if we're making that big jump, we have to recognize that is a big jump. If that's what we want, great, but let's talk about the risk. Let's talk about the cost. Let's talk about the time. Let's talk about the value we get out of our investments in technology. It may be that we're too risk adverse when we fully understand what it is we're really saying. It may be that we want to back off that expectation because we're just risk adverse, or we have never been successful with change in the past. So why would we now think that we're going to go through this big, massive change and somehow be successful overnight? So maybe we back that off and go for a more incremental, lower cost, potentially lower value, but lower risk approach. And I'm not saying either of these answers, by the way, are right or wrong. I honestly don't think there is a right answer. All I can say is if I look at a client and understand them, I can tell them what I think they're trying to do and what I think would make the most sense for them. But I don't believe in cookie cutter, one size fits all strategies. And that's the whole point of this presentation, is to talk about how can we navigate who we are and who we want to be, and how can we make decisions and get everyone on the team that's not here in this room right now, how can we get them all on the same page with the direction we're going? And so this is just an example of an exercise, and there's a lot of different criteria we can go through around decision making, and it's great for debate and discussion because, again, it's that love and logic mentality with executives where you have two options, let's just say, and there's no perfect one. I know you're looking for the silver bullet, but it doesn't exist. So let's make the decision that you're most comfortable with, knowing what the risks and the benefits are. And if we can do that and get everyone on the same page and understanding what the risks and the benefits are and comfortable with that, then we're a lot more likely to succeed regardless of what the answer is. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. I think too often we look for that perfect strategy, that perfect business model, that perfect digital transformation strategy that's just gonna be magical for us. And that's not the case. What's more important is to say we made a decision. It may or may not be a perfect decision, but we are moving forward, all operating from the same hymn book, if you will. The other is to understand the current processes. A lot of times there's a mentality that, we're going through a transformation. We are implementing new technologies. We're very hyper-focused on the future state. So we don't care about the current state. And I understand why that might be the mentality for people going in, because if you think your processes are broken and inefficient, why would you want to focus too much time analyzing them? But the reality is there's probably a lot of good things you're doing that you're very good at, and we need to understand what those things are so that the digital transformation could actually build on that. And secondly, maybe even more importantly, your people understand the way things are today. They do not understand how things are going to be going forward, especially because we haven't even defined what it is going forward. So to relate the changes back to people and to help them through the change, we have to start with where they are today, meet them there, and then bringing them along. And if we don't take time to assess the current state and understand what the current state processes are, we're going to fail in that regard from a change management perspective. And by the way, we're probably going to defer too much to the technology and make it all about the technology rather than this is our business, this is how it should work, regardless of what technology we use. And so assessing current business processes is important. Now, of course, there's a fine line here. You don't want to overanalyze and just get stuck in analysis paralysis. We do not need to document every single workflow and granular micro business process within our business, but we do need to understand in general, how are things working? What are the differences between different departments and different locations? And we need to define where we're starting from, because that's going to help from a change perspective, as I mentioned, but it's also going to help us understand the magnitude of change. How big of a change does this really entail for our business, which will then drive how long it's going to take, which will then drive how much it costs, which will then drive, hopefully, realistic expectations. And by the way, if I had to pick a number 2 root cause for failure, I'd say it's unrealistic expectations. That'd be the one I would rank number 2. Companies that don't understand how long something is really going to take or what the risks really are, their failure rate is so much higher because they're forced into bad decisions. They have to cut back. They try to cram too much in too little time with too little money, and they just set themselves up for failure. So having realistic expectations is really important, and assessing your current state and knowing where you're starting from in your journey is a really important factor in accomplishing that. Just like you want to look at your business processes, you want to also understand and look at your organization. In the panel discussion we just had, we were talking about emerging technologies up here. For those of you that weren't here, we talked about emerging technologies, and one of the things we talked about is how there's an organizational design component of change management. So when you look at something like AI that is completely transformative, potentially long-term, it's going to impact people's jobs very significantly. And we have to define how it's going to affect people's jobs. We don't want it just to happen organically. We want to define, this is how we want to use AI to make our people better at what they do. And this is how their roles and responsibilities are going to change. If we're automating part of their job, what are we replacing that with? If we don't do that, people are going to be very confused. Speaking of confused, I'm not sure why the slides are doing that. I swear I'm not touching anything. If people are confused and if they don't understand and they're confused, they are going to assume the worst and they're going to push back on technology. So that's why we have to really make sure we evaluate where we are today, understand what the change impacts are to people, and also understand how we need to upskill people. How do we need to train them and teach them to be even better at what they do? We also want to look at current systems and architecture, and you can see a theme here. We're talking about looking at the current state, and you may think, well, let's just get on with it. Let's get on to the digital strategy part of it. But we have to start somewhere. We have to start and ground ourselves with where we are today. We've talked about people and processes. Now we talk about technology. What systems do we have today? How many gray market underground systems are out there that we don't even know about? How many spreadsheets are out there that no one knew existed except for that one person that's using them every day? Those are the types of things we need to dig up. It's almost like a treasure hunt of sorts to go find all these different systems that people are using. We had one client that they had counted up over 500 different systems they were using in applications throughout the organization, and at least half of those no one knew about until we took the time to go through this inventory of documenting them all. So that was pretty eye-opening to this client, because they had no idea that all these different applications were spread out through the organization. Data was everywhere, and that's intellectual property. That's knowledge within your organization that it has been lost. And so being able to bring that all together and understand where all that stuff is really important to create a roadmap that not only is sure to bring along that technology and consider how that technology is going to fit into the long-term roadmap, but it's also just going to paint a clear vision of how we're going to decommission those systems potentially. What's the strategy? What's the plan to get off of some of these old systems and to replace these old systems with whatever you're replacing it with? And then performance measures. Here's where a lot of companies get stuck, and I think they gloss over this pretty significantly. Organizations will go into a project like this. They've been told that they need to go through a digital transformation, either because the vendor sunset the product, or their old system just isn't supported anymore, or it's a system that's broken and they can't scale the company anymore. So there's a lot of times there's a burning platform that we just have to do something. And how many of you are in that boat where you feel like you have to do something for whatever reason? Whether it's a good reason, bad reason, doesn't really matter, but you have a really compelling reason of why you're about to go through this. Does anyone have that? Okay, a few of you. Does anyone not have it? Let me ask you that. Does anyone just going through this and you're not quite sure why? You just were sent to this conference because you were told you had to be here? No? Okay, well, that's good. And if you could tell me afterwards if you're afraid to raise your hand there, I will not judge you, I promise. But the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times organizations don't feel like they need to really worry about measures or a business case. They think, well, why spend the time calculating ROI? We have to go through this project. Okay, let's just say that's true. Let's just say you have to go through the project because whatever the reason is. How do you know if you're going to declare success? Like, what is your definition of success? How are we going to measure and track how much time and effort and risk we're imposing on the organization? We can't do any of that unless we start to lay out performance metrics that are not just used as a business case justification tool, but are used to actually track benefits along the way. And it also creates a way for us to have project governance to where when we make decisions, such as, do we want to invest that extra time and money to buy that additional module or to customize this piece of software over here or to go buy this bolt-on over here, those decisions are really hard to make if you're not tying it back to metrics somehow. If we can't justify it by saying, well, this is actually going to help us reduce our inventory level materially more than we could with this other technology we're already using, so that's why we think we should invest extra time and money and impose more risk over here, then great, then it probably does make sense. But if you can't justify it, then you really have to ask yourself, well, why would we do it then? If we're going to invest all this time and money to customize or to buy this new software, but we can't point to any real measurable benefit, then why are we doing it? And those measures become really important because it helps you make decisions along the way in a way that's very aligned, and it sort of provides you a North Star to guide you along the way. And then here's where we look at comparing alternatives. And this is where, again, the love and logic theme comes in here with executives and decision-making throughout an organization, is looking at all the different options we have. I mean, you see some examples up here on the left side, or I'm sorry, on the right side of your screen, things around your business process strategy that we talked about. Are we going to standardize? Are we going to decentralize? Somewhere in between? Is it a mix depending on what part of the business we're talking about? Do we want a single ERP system or do we want best of breed? That's a big decision. And guess what? Neither in that example, both examples, there is no easy answer. Either side, either extreme you might choose is going to have trade-offs. They're going to have different benefits and different risks. And just because you eliminated some of the risks by making a different decision, that probably just means you just introduced new risk. You just replaced the risk that you had over here with these new risks over here. And so making those deliberate decisions that aren't overly optimistic and aren't filtered through rose-colored glasses is super important. And so being able to compare those alternatives and look objectively at all the different decisions we need to make in a transformation while we're planning for it is super important. And the more of this we can do up front, the more we get that alignment that I was talking about before, the more we have a realistic plan, because now we've actually traded off and understood what those trade-offs are, and we've made those deliberate decisions that we think is the best fit for us. Now suddenly we're driving that alignment to keep us all on the same page and go in the same direction, and having a strategy that just fits our overall business. And I think the other thing too, if I'm going to add one more thing here, I'd also say, when you're looking at your alternatives, it's so easy to think, well, everyone over here is talking about AI, and we haven't really built much AI into our overall strategy. If you've got bigger fish to fry and you can't even close the books on a timely basis because your technology is so outdated, start there. Just start, get the basics in place, make some incremental changes. That's okay. I think there's a negative connotation sometimes with not keeping up with technology, and it creates this sort of stigma, this FOMO. I know Emma, who's back here, just did a video, and so I'm stealing this idea from her, but she's talking about FOMO and technology. And now I owe her royalties because I was hoping she wasn't in the room to hear me steal her idea. But so you take FOMO, people have this fear of missing out. They feel like, well, everyone else is implementing AI or everyone else is doing advanced analytics or whatever. And that's not a good reason either. And it's okay to fall behind, or not fall behind, but not keep up with the vendors. And I think that's just what you have to recognize is you can start slow, you can speed up, you can make progress. And as long as you're moving forward at the pace that makes sense for you, then you're going to be in good shape. But you do want to make those comparisons and objective comparisons of alternatives for sure. And then once you've done all this stuff, then we define what that 3 to 5 year roadmap is. I wouldn't think much beyond 5 years. In fact, it's a stretch to really think at 3 years, quite frankly, the way things change. You just look at COVID and all the merger and acquisition activity, all the economic turmoil and wars and supply chain disruptions. There's so much happening in the world right now, it's really hard to plan even 3 years out. But, knowing that 3 to 5 year plan may change, it's going to evolve, you might have to pivot along the way, but at least have something laid out that starts with all the stuff we've talked about so far, which is defining where we are today, where we're going, how we're going to get there, what risks we know we're taking on and how we're going to mitigate those risks, how this supports our overall strategy, how we're going to measure success, all that stuff you want to have laid out as part of your 3 to 5 year roadmap. And again, all this stuff I'm talking about, if you look at what most organizations do, they don't spend the time doing this. They end up come to a show like this, they get enamored by some technology, they go buy it, And then they try to figure out, okay, now let's back into how are we going to go implement this? And that's a really backwards way of doing it, because you're likely to overinvest in technology you're never going to use anytime soon. You're likely to not have that alignment. You're likely not to understand where it is you're going. And so why waste all that time and money now when you could be spending some time getting this all figured out so that you make smarter decisions along the way? And then defining a business case and benefits realization plan. The one thing I'll just add to this, even though I sort of alluded to this point already, the one thing I would say is when you create a business case to take to your board or to your management team to justify the project, which hopefully you're doing, then you want to make sure you're not just being overly optimistic and putting in numbers that give you the answer you're looking for. You want to really look at how much could we really reduce our inventory, or how much could we really speed up cycle times, and how. By the way, how's the technology really going to help us do that? What else would we need besides just new technology to be able to do that? What kind of behavioral changes would we need to invest in? What kind of process changes would we have to make internally to drive that level of benefit? So really understanding how we're going to achieve benefits realization and tying it to the decisions that are made in the project is really important. And no one wants to do this, but if you can measure benefits after you've rolled out new changes, it's scary, because you're going to find you didn't get the benefits you expected right away. That's normal. But if you don't measure it and you don't understand how you fell short, why you fell short, where you fell short, you're never going to achieve it. So my question to organizations is, rather than just jumping ahead and moving quickly into phase 2 of the project or the next location of the rollout, why not spend a little bit of time there after you just spent however long you spent all this time and money to get to that go live? Why not spend just a little bit of time optimizing and fine tuning that to where you're actually getting business value and you're maximizing that investment that you've already made? And guess what? By doing that, you're going to learn a lot of what you could do better in the next phase of the project. So you might as well just wait and get that right in the first phase and then move on to the next phase. So there's a lot of value in creating that benefits realization plan and thinking of things from more of an objective, measurable perspective. And then this is important too, defining your change management plan. It starts with how big of a change we're going to impose on the organization. You know, if you think of it as a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being massive change, 1 being more of an incremental change, and obviously everything in between, you have to say, well, if we're at 9 out of 10, that implementation plan is going to look totally different for that exact organization if they were a 2 out of 10. And again, these are all deliberate decisions we're making. We've intentionally made the decision that yes, we're going to take on a big change, or no, we're not. But now we've got to make a plan, a change management plan for how we're going to get people to adapt to the software, and how we're going to, the change strategies we're going to deploy to accommodate that. And the change management plan and people's ability to change is usually the critical path activity on a project plan. Usually you're going to implement technology and do all the technical stuff a lot faster than the people and the operations and the organization is able to change. So if we don't do this change management plan and don't understand what our change strategy is, then we don't have a realistic implementation plan to begin with, because we have no idea how we're going to manage change, and we have no idea how long it's going to take. We know that we can implement technology in X amount of time, but this isn't about implementing technology, it's about changing the business. So we've got to figure out what's the plan to change the business. And to do that, we need to know what the change impacts are and what the overall change strategy is. And then the last thing I'd say is leverage outside independent help. Yes, this is self-serving, I'll admit it, but whether it's Third Stage or anyone else, having someone that is not there to sell you software and not there to be biased to push you one direction over another is super important, because a lot of times these decisions get emotional, decisions get made based on other factors that maybe are not business related. It may be that vendor's pressuring you, or vendor is giving you a huge discount if you sign this deal by the end of the quarter, or by the end of the year, end of the day, or whatever it is. You'll get this huge discount. And a lot of times those emotional decisions lead to bad decisions. So having someone that can objectively challenge you, and again, we don't want to be total skeptics and total Debbie Downers, but we also don't want to be overly optimistic and create these unrealistic expectations for what a project is really going to look like, or what it's going to take to succeed. Defining a digital strategy can oftentimes be overwhelming, because there's so many different directions and alternatives that you could be pursuing. And it's really important to narrow down the focus of your digital strategy so that you're not focused on alternatives that just don't make sense for your organization. So what I want to do in this next segment is talk about the 4 major technical decisions that you need to make to ensure that you're on the same page with where you're taking your digital strategy. And these aren't four separate decisions. It's typically choosing which of these four options makes the most sense for your organization given what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. And one thing I'll share here is that there is no one right answer. There's no one best answer. There's no one answer that I would recommend to you because I don't know you, I don't know your business, and I don't know what you're trying to accomplish. But based on this next segment, my hope is that you'll watch this and it'll give you a sense of which of these four alternatives make the most sense for your digital strategy so you can focus your efforts on pursuing that strategy and diving into the different sub-alternatives within that strategy.
The first option you have as an organization, and this has historically been the most common option for organizations, is to select a single ERP system that's going to address the needs of your entire organization. Now, the main advantage of single ERP system is, first of all, it's integrated end-to-end processes. And what this means is you don't need to have different technologies to address different departments or different locations or different workflows within your organization. And that's one of the big reasons why organizations are so enamored by single ERP systems, is they think that one system can house all of their business processes and house all the technology they need for their enterprise technology needs. Somewhat related to that is another advantage, and that is you have one system, and that's a single source of truth. So not only are your processes and your technologies integrated, but now all the information that is housed within your organization is contained in this one system. So now you don't need to worry about going to multiple systems and getting different answers for the same question, or you don't need to go to multiple systems to get an answer or do an analysis that requires multiple data sets. Now, in theory, you should be able to go to one single ERP system that gives you the single source of truth that you need as it relates to your business operations. So these are two of the major advantages, but the disadvantages are just as important to understand as well. The first one is that ERP systems can be very expensive. And you might argue, well, ERP systems aren't any more expensive, or maybe they're even less expensive than some of the other three options we'll talk about. And that may or may not be true. More often than not, ERP systems are a lot more expensive than organizations think. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. One is ERP systems are end-to-end business processes. They're single systems that automate your entire business, and that means that's a lot of software. That's a big investment in not only the software itself, but more importantly, it's a big investment in changing all those processes, all those people, converting all that data that you might have had in place for decades or even longer. The other big expense that comes with ERP systems that is often under-realized and underrated is that the operational disruption caused by putting in a single ERP system is very disruptive. If you think about it, you're ripping out the guts of your organization and you're replacing it with another system. And that means you're putting the entire organization at risk, not just one subset of the organization, but the entire thing. So that expense is a real thing that you really need to make sure you understand. The other consideration is that ERP systems are risky. That's somewhat similar to the point I just made in terms of it being expensive. It's also risky because now you run the risk of having a material operational disruption at the time you're flipping the switch from your old technology or technologies to a single ERP system. And again, the reason for that is because now that you've integrated all of your business processes and your data and your workflows into one system, just one break or one problem in the implementation or in the workflows can have a domino effect and affect your entire operations. We see a lot of organizations that tried to implement ERP systems ineffectively, and they ran into so many problems that they couldn't ship product, they couldn't close the books, they couldn't run payroll. Major operational disruptions like that can be very expensive and very risky, and a lot of organizations simply can't or don't want to take that risk, understandably so. So it's important to understand that there are benefits to ERP systems, but there's also downside risks as well. And now we'll get into the other three options you have as well. Another option that organizations have is best-of-breed technologies. And best-of-breed is similar to ERP, but a little bit different. It's a lot like ERP in that you're addressing your end-to-end business processes, but it's different in that you're not necessarily doing it with one single system. So in other words, instead of having one ERP system that will handle order processing and forecasting and financials and accounting, manufacturing, warehouse management, payroll, etc., now you have different systems to address different needs. So you might have, instead of just one big system, you might have multiple systems that do different things that are all integrated together to provide that end-to-end solution that you might also get out of an ERP system. Now, when I first say that, it may sound like best of breed is not nearly as appealing as single ERP, but if you look at the pros and cons, it can actually be very appealing. The first reason why it's appealing to organizations is because it allows you to find the software that's the best fit for different parts of your organization. Many cases, organizations that are implementing a single ERP system find that this system can't address all or even most of their needs, and they end up with big gaps and big deficiencies in what the ERP system gives them, and they end up settling or compromising in certain parts of their business. So the fact that you're likely to get a better fit across different parts of your organization is something that's very appealing. And in many cases, you find that these best-of-breed solutions can give you more value and a better fit with what you need in different parts of your organization. The other reason why best-of-breed is appealing to a lot of organizations is because it supports a more agile or more nimble approach to change within an organization. So we'll just call that agility for now. So that agility is something that's very appealing to organizations. And the reason it's more agile in many cases than a single ERP system is that you don't have to define all of your end-to-end processes and take on a big, massive undertaking with best of breed. You could pick off certain parts of your organization, certain processes, certain departments, certain functions, and find technologies that just address that part of the business. And oftentimes that's going to be lower cost and lower risk than taking on the entire big, massive, complex ERP implementation. And for a lot of organizations, that makes a lot of sense. It's easier to get, in many cases, alignment and support for a smaller investment that gives you incremental improvement than taking on a bigger, riskier ERP implementation. However, there's also risks with best-of-breed solutions as well. They're not as perfect as they may sound so far. The first is integration issues. When you have multiple systems, now you've got to figure out how you're going to tie those systems together so that your processes can flow end-to-end, so that your data can flow, so that you have one single source of truth for data and you're not worried about conflicting data in different systems. And that can be difficult and complex and risky and costly from an architecture and a technical perspective. Now, having said that, I'm going to come back to one point here with single ERP systems, and that is even with a single ERP system, you still have to do a certain amount of integration because you have different modules within an ERP system. And those different modules require integration to the other modules. The only difference here is you've got one single system and a single tool set for integrating those systems, which makes it a little bit easier and faster and cheaper than in this case. So this puts more pressure on the organization from a technical perspective. It might add to your cost line item here on integration, but it may also be that you have the advantages here that outweigh that cost. And the other downside risk of best-of-breed solutions is that it oftentimes results in a lack of clarity around the bigger picture direction of your technology landscape. So I refer to this as a short-sighted digital strategy. It's not always a bad thing, but it can be. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's just say you decide that your sales force, your sales organization is the area you want to start with, and they're chomping at the bit for a new CRM system so they can track leads better, close more deals, generate more revenue and commission, et cetera. So you may decide, let's go buy and implement a new CRM system. Nothing wrong with that. It can deliver immediate value. It allows you to be more agile. Great stuff, right? But at the end of the day, the challenge with that is now you may be picking a CRM system that doesn't support longer-term needs from a technology perspective. Let's just say in the future, you also decide that you want to get a new manufacturing system or a new order management system, and that CRM system that you've deployed doesn't play nice with that other system. And if you haven't looked at the entire big picture in advance and planned that out, you might find yourself backed into a corner with a technology that works well for the sales team, but it's not there to support the longer-term digital strategy and roadmap of the organization. So one way around this, one way to mitigate that risk is to define your digital strategy up front, define what the best-of-breed tech stack is going to look like, and then start deploying it piece by piece as you see fit and as you prioritize. So having said all that, these are some of the pros and cons of best-of-breed. And now let's talk about custom development and platforms and how they compare to these two solutions as well. And this term isn't nearly as cool as it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, but it's still something that's very relevant, something worth considering. And custom development essentially says we're not going to necessarily go buy anything off the shelf or out of the box. We're going to create our own technology. And it may sound crazy on the surface, but there is some advantage to this as well. Let me get to that here. First of all, probably most importantly, custom dev allows you to find the perfect fit. It's the only one of the four options where you are going to get exactly what you want if you do it right. These other options we talk about, the other three, aren't going to give you what you want. You're inevitably going to end up with something that's a bit watered down and not quite what it is you want. And I hesitate to use the word perfect fit, but I think it is relevant here because in theory, you can do whatever you want with that technology. You can develop to do exactly what you want, how you want it, and it's something that can't be replicated by your customer. And that leads to a second benefit, which is it gives you a competitive advantage if you do it right. Now, in theory, these other three solutions can also give you a competitive advantage, but not to the same degree that a custom dev solution can. And not only is it giving you a competitive advantage, probably even more importantly, is it's harder to replicate. This makes it a lot harder for a competitor to knock off or rip off your competitive advantage or those things that make you unique and make you better than your competition. If you do find what you're looking for in these other solutions, your competitors can go get that same solution and build that same competency within their organization. So this is the only one of the three that gives you a true, sustainable competitive advantage that's very hard to replicate across your competitors. Now, with these advantages, just like the other three options, comes some distinct disadvantages as well. First and foremost, this is an expensive solution. They're all expensive solutions, but this is probably the most expensive because you're not getting the benefit of R&D and scale and economies of scale that some of these other solutions provide from all the R&D and innovation that's invested by the software vendors. Here, you're creating the wheel yourself, which may be okay. It may be that you're creating this high barrier to entry that's going to be hard for vendors and your competitors to replicate, and maybe that's okay. But you have to make sure if you do custom dev, it's something that's actually giving you a distinct competitive advantage. Otherwise, why not just go with an off-the-shelf solution? The other disadvantage here is that this option is very hard to maintain. It's probably the hardest to maintain of the four options we talk about here. What I mean by this is you don't have the benefit of a software vendor constantly investing in R&D and innovation improvements to the technology. Now it's on you to maintain that. Not only is that expensive, but it's difficult. It's something you have to stay on top of. Chances are you're going to have to invest in a larger, more robust internal IT department, which, again, may be worth it if these advantages play out the way you think they will. So custom dev is something that is worth considering. It's probably the least discussed of the four options that we're going to talk about here today, but it is something that's often overlooked and underrated in the digital strategy space. Now, the fourth option is software platforms. And software platforms a little different, similar to these two, but a little bit different. A software platform is more than just an application. It's an actual platform that not only houses one or more applications, but it also gives you a framework to do what I might call semi-custom development. You have tools that you can use to build on a platform that's a common platform that's supported by a vendor, used by other customers and people throughout the community. So it takes away some of these downside risks of truly custom dev solutions and gives you somewhat of a best of all worlds solution here. That's probably the biggest advantage here, is that software platforms give you that best of all worlds. Now, before I move on, let me give you a couple examples of what a software platform is. If you've ever heard of Salesforce, you may think of that as a CRM software vendor, and it is. But a lot of people don't know that Salesforce also has a Force platform that Salesforce was built on, but they've opened it up to third-party developers to create other types of applications on that Salesforce platform. So if you go buy Salesforce, you don't only limit yourself to Salesforce, you also open yourself up to third parties that have created solutions built on that same platform. So it's almost like a best-of-breed sort of solution, but it's all on the same platform, and that can save you time and money and give you that integration and cost effectiveness that you may not get with some of these other options. Another example is Palantir, which is sort of a, I don't want to say middleware on steroids, but it's probably the best way to simplify it right now. You can actually find a review of Palantir right here. If you watch this video right here, I do a review of Palantir. But they're a solution that actually integrates multiple systems. So if you've got these old legacy systems that are well entrenched within your organization and hard to replace, you could put in a product like Palantir that gives you more advanced workflows and AI and reporting and things like that, and a better user interface, all on that platform that ties together your legacy systems. And then another example I'll share is a company called Rapid. And Rapid is spelled R-A-P-P-I-T, and it's actually founded by Jan Baan, who founded Baan Software back in the 90s, if you remember that. He and his team have created a platform that ties together multiple systems and provides integrated workflows, more of a composable ERP approach. So those are just a few examples. There's a lot more software platforms out there. Even some of the traditional ERP vendors are moving towards that platform model. NetSuite, for example, now is opening their platform to third parties to create different systems. Microsoft Dynamics has also opened up its platform to third-party developers. So platforms are a thing of the future, and a lot of organizations are moving that direction. Which leads me to another advantage in that software platforms in many cases can allow you to leverage the existing technology you already have. This can be a very appealing factor for big organizations, especially, and very mature, older organizations. If they have legacy systems that have been around for a long time, well entrenched in the organization, it's going to be highly risky, in some cases impossible to rip those systems out and replace them. You may navigate that by putting a platform in place that ties together multiple systems that you already have. At the very least, it buys you time to have a better user interface and take advantage of AI and better reporting and analytics. Buys you more time to take advantage of that modern technology while you figure out how you might replace some of those back-end legacy systems. But platforms also come with downside risks. Platforms can be a bit harder to maintain because you're inherently now talking about having multiple systems, much like the best-of-breed option. It also requires you to have more of an internal IT staff that can support those multiple systems and stay on top of advancements and other possibilities within that platform. But again, if you find that the advantages are there, that disadvantage or that investment might be acceptable. And then much like the best-of-breed option, the software platform option makes it easier to get fragmented between your multiple systems that you're deploying. Just because you have multiple systems or applications on the same platform doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to integrate magically. You now have to figure out how you can address the fragmentation and pull together the multiple workflows and data sources. So now that we understand what the 4 different options are, let's talk about how to decide which one is best for you. So we've got 4 major buckets of options that we can pursue with our digital strategy. How do we know which one is best? Now, each one has strengths and weaknesses. There's no silver bullet. There's no perfect answer. So what you really have to do is look at different parts of your business and determine what the priorities are for different parts of your business. Not only that, you also have to look strategically as an organization, what are your long-term goals and objectives as an organization, and which one of these solutions are going to best support you. Now, one thing that's really important to point out is that you don't have to choose just one solution. You might find that you're going to lead with a single ERP approach, but you might augment it with a custom dev approach where you're going to take some of your areas of competitive advantage, very isolated. You're going to invest in some custom development to bolt onto your ERP system. Or you might find that you're going to find an ERP system, but you're going to find an ERP system that also enables a certain platform that opens things up to third-party developers. So this is where Microsoft Dynamics 365 becomes appealing. This is where NetSuite or Salesforce might become appealing. So you look at ERP systems that also have a platform, and that might be an option as well. What often happens with our clients too is that they say we want to lead with a single ERP system, but we're going to use a best-of-breed approach to fill in some of the gaps, to fill in the blanks of what a single ERP system can't do. A lot of times clients think they're going to just pick one system, and then they quickly realize no one system is going to give them everything they need, so they end up with sort of a hybrid solution there. So there's a lot of ways to mix and match, but you really have to understand what your goals and objectives as an organization are in terms of how you're trying to scale the organization, how much you're trying to standardize operations, how much are you trying to outsource your IT department, how risk tolerant are you, what does your budget look like? All those factors and considerations need to be incorporated into the decision process here.
Part of defining a digital strategy is recognizing where you are today and where you're headed in the future. And a really important but overlooked aspect of that is defining how big the change is for your organization. Some organizations decide to pursue a relatively safe path, which is a more incremental change to their processes and their technologies. Other organizations are more aggressive and want to take big quantum leaps and big massive improvements in their business model. And most organizations are somewhere in between. So in order to have a realistic strategy and a realistic roadmap and plan and a budget and a resource allocation, you need to know how big the magnitude of change is, and you need to adjust your strategy and roadmap accordingly to account for the amount of risk and change that you're taking on. So in this next segment, we'll dive into how to understand the magnitude of change that you're about to undertake and how that affects your digital strategy and your roadmap.
It sounds as though every organization should go through these big, massive digital transformations that are meant to totally overhaul the way you do business. And while that may be suitable for some organizations, it's definitely not suitable for a lot of organizations. It can be hard to figure out whether or not one or the other is right for you. And it can be hard to figure out where on the continuum of evolution versus revolution your organization might fall. And so in today's video, I want to talk about how to decide where you might fall on that spectrum. So the first thing you need to really objectively and honestly ask yourself is my organization really ready for change? And how much change can my organization really handle? Now, in theory, a lot of organizations think our people are ready for change, we're used to change, we're used to changing technologies, we're used to changing customers or product lines or whatever the case may be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a big, massive transformation, a revolutionary transformation, is appropriate for you. And in some cases, organizations that go through a lot of changes in other areas, whether it's expansion into new markets or acquisitions of other companies, or even just growing quickly and bringing out a lot of new employees, that may suggest to some that you're ready for big, massive changes, but actually that can undermine your readiness for change and may suggest that a more incremental, steadier, lower risk approach is more suitable. So it's really important to look at how big of a change are we really willing to make and how much change are our people willing to go through. And once you have a better understanding of that, that's going to point you in one direction or the other. The other question that's important to ask yourself is how much risk is my organization really willing to take? And for some organizations, it starts at the top. It's a cultural thing as far as risk tolerance. Some organizations are naturally more entrepreneurial or more aggressive in their growth plans and their changes in general. Other organizations are very conservative and don't like abrupt changes. So depending on where you fall on the spectrum and your level of risk tolerance, that's oftentimes going to lead you down the path of which side of the continuum you might fall on. Now, just because you might be risk adverse today or you might be super aggressive and risk tolerant today doesn't mean you can't bend or change where you fall on that spectrum, but it's important to recognize you're probably not going to change overnight in terms of your risk tolerance. And if it's a core part of your culture and your management team and your overall company style, you need to really fit within the boundaries of that reality and understand that you might be able to bend or tweak that a little bit, but you're not overnight going to change to support something that you're not. So really understanding how much risk you're willing to take as an organization is something that will lead you down either a more revolutionary path, which is generally higher risk, but could also be higher reward, versus a more evolutionary path, which is more incremental, lower risk, but potentially lower reward as well. Part of defining where you fall in the spectrum of incremental evolution versus more dramatic revolution is to figure out how you're going to phase technology. So oftentimes the answers to the previous questions I've asked will lead you to the answer on how you're going to phase technology. But in other cases, you may want to lay out a potential phasing strategy of technology and process and people changes, and then validate through the lens of those previous questions I asked, as far as does this fit our risk profile? Does the ROI make sense for who we are? Does the risk profile make sense? Does the magnitude of change make sense for who we are? And so oftentimes having different options and different scenarios you can objectively look at can be very effective in terms of getting internal alignment on what this transformation is going to mean to us as an organization. Now, one thing to note and one word of caution when defining the answers to this as well as other questions is that software vendors and system integrators are economically incentivized to push you towards the revolutionary model. They're incentivized to sell you more software, to convince you that new technologies are going to totally transform your business, but that may be true longer term. It doesn't mean it all needs to happen overnight. So we need to figure out, based on our own objective view of ourselves and what we want to be when we grow up, what phasing strategy makes the most sense from a technology perspective. Now, once you've defined where you think you fall on the whole continuum of incremental evolution to more dramatic revolution, we now need to figure out how change management will support whatever direction we're going. And I'll start off by saying that change management is going to be super critical to whatever direction you go. Even if you're planning more of an incremental change and evolutionary change to your business, that's still change and it's still going to stress people out and it's still going to be difficult from a change perspective. So it's not to suggest that you don't need change management if you do this. But if you do the revolutionary approach where it's the more bigger, higher risk change management becomes exponentially more important. So instead of investing heavily in change management, you're going to be investing very heavily in change management. So that's probably the best way to view it, and really understand that if we decide that we're on the side of the spectrum that supports the more revolutionary, big swing for the fences type of changes, that's going to require a lot more investment in organizational change management. And we need to do two things. One is we need to make sure our organization is aligned on that expectations and understands what those changes are going to be. But it also means that we need to define a change strategy that is aligned with those realities. So regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, it's important to have a change management strategy that you can dial in to align with whatever direction you're going. So in determining the final answer on what direction you want to go here, evolution versus revolution, it's important to look out for your own best interest and look at who you are as an organization. Don't worry too much about what software vendors are telling you or what your peers are doing or what other players in other industries are doing. It can be really tempting to get caught up in all the things you could be doing or the things you're not doing. But it's important to really look inward and understand what it is we're doing today, what our strengths are, what we really want to accomplish as an organization, and what our tolerance is for the risk and the changes that come along with the transformation to dial in a strategy and approach that makes the most sense for us as an organization. So don't be too pressured by software vendors or system integrators or outside consultants to tell you you need to do one thing or the other. You really need to just understand objectively what it is you're trying to accomplish to define the strategy that makes the most sense for you.
Once we've defined our overall digital strategy and roadmap, now we need to translate that into a plan, an actionable plan that we can put dates behind, owners, milestones, dependencies, critical path items, that sort of thing. And so what I want to do in this next segment is start to talk about how we can springboard from a high-level digital strategy and some of the decisions we've made from the topics earlier in this video into a more actionable plan that we can start to execute on in our digital transformation.
If you're an organization going through a digital transformation or an ERP implementation and your executive team isn't all on the same page or they don't have a clear vision of how this project is going to support their future direction, then I would suggest you're not ready to start the project. You shouldn't be starting the project. And the reason for that is it creates a lot of headwinds that work against you as a project team. Let's just assume you have an executive team of, say, 7 people. If you start on a project and those 7 people on the executive team have 7 different opinions of what they want this project to be and what they want the organization to look like in the future, that project is destined to fail. So what we have to do is make sure that we get the executives on the same page and that we get the project and the overall direction of the project on the same page with the executives. If we don't do that, then the project will run into problems later on, and that's going to end up costing you a lot more time and money than it would have taken you just to get this right up front. So one of the first things you could do in phase 0 is make sure that you have strategic alignment, that you've taken the time to really focus on and articulate what the future direction of the company is and how exactly this project will support that future direction. And I'll just give you a couple examples here. Some of the examples of decisions that need to be made and agreed upon by the executive team would be things like, what are our overall goals and objectives for this project? In other words, what are those quantifiable, measurable results we expect from the project? How much do we want to standardize our business processes? Which parts of our business do we want to standardize? Which parts do we want to leave independent or decentralized? How much are we willing to change our business to fit the software versus changing the software to fit the business? These may sound like technical decisions or project management-based decisions, but these are decisions that have to be made by the executive team, or at least agreed upon by the executive team. And these aren't easy answers, by the way. There's a lot of trade-offs, a lot of pros and cons and risks to whatever decision you make, and so it takes time to work through that. But once you get alignment and you get everyone on the same page, now all of a sudden you've converted headwinds into tailwinds, and you can start your implementation. It's going to be a lot more successful. So make sure you have strategic alignment. That's one of the first steps in phase 0. One of the most common fallacies with digital transformation is that if you just pick the software and deploy the software, that will determine what your business processes are going to look like in the future. This is a very flawed assumption because today's modern technology is so flexible that there's a lot of different ways, a whole multitude of different ways that you can deploy that technology. And if you don't have a sense of what you want the technology to do, it's going to take you a lot of time making those decisions as a team while the meter's running and you're racking up time and cost and expense on the project. So it's really important that you have that sort of blueprint from a future state operating model and a future state business process perspective of what you want to look like. And I'm not suggesting here at this point that you go down to the micro level of detail of defining individual transactions and workflows and different screens you might use, because you may not know. This is new technology and there's only so much you know about the technology before you deploy it. So instead, what we need to do is start at that macro level, define what our end-to-end business processes are, what are the common business processes we might want to deploy throughout the organization. If we're an organization that's gone out and acquired through mergers and acquisitions, and we have 10 or 20 different ways of operating, we might need to take some time to decide what's that one way we're going to operate when we deploy technologies. Now, if you think about it, if we don't make those decisions up front, those decisions will take up a lot of time during implementation, and worse yet, it'll create a lot of
resistance to change, because now you're going to have people infighting and bickering over what that future state should be. So you want to get all that out on the table and work through that messiness early on. And again, by doing this and creating that operational blueprint, you're going to create exponentially more value and more efficiency and more cost reduction later on during your implementation than if you hadn't done that. So defining your future state business processes and operating model is a key part of Phase Zero. And to learn more about how to do this, how do you handle business process management within Phase Zero, I encourage you to check out this video on my YouTube channel that dives into business process management and how it works. You may have heard that organizational change management is one of, if not the most important reasons why digital transformations fail. But organizations commonly don't understand what change management is, or they assume that their organization is immune to resistance to change and other change issues. Because again, when you first start a project after you've selected technologies, there's this misleading perception that everyone's excited about the project, therefore change management won't be difficult. The reality is it is going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot more difficult than you expect. In fact, I have yet to meet a CIO or any project team member anywhere in the world for any client I've ever done work with that has said change management was easier than they thought, or that they've done enough change management through the project. Every single case or every single instance, even with clients we've worked with, have said they wish they would have spent more time on change management. So the question is, well, what do we do at this point in the project? We don't know what the changes are yet. We don't know what the business processes are going to look like necessarily, at least not at the detailed level. And we certainly aren't ready to start training or detailed communications or anything of that nature. What we can do is start to anticipate where the pockets of resistance are going to reside within the organization. And we also can start to assess how severe that resistance to change might be. And the way we do that is through an organizational readiness assessment, which involves two prongs. One is a quantitative anonymous employee survey. The other is a qualitative set of focus groups that together paint a picture of what the culture of the organization is, what some of the strengths and weaknesses of the organization are. And if you're skilled at doing this and you do this day in and day out like our team does at Third Stage, you'll know what some of those anticipated points of resistance are going to be, and you can create a change management strategy that really surgically targets those areas to proactively address those areas of resistance before they become unmanageable. Now, on the surface, if you ask employees if they're ready for change or if they're excited, chances are pretty high. Most, if not all of them, are going to say, yep, we're excited, we're ready, we understand. We don't like our current systems and our current processes, so we're craving new technologies. However, when you start to peel back the layers of the onion and you start to define how jobs are going to change and which jobs are going to have things taken away, which jobs might be automated or centralized, which spreadsheets might be taken away, all those things create resistance. And so we have to anticipate what those things are so that we can start to create a change plan around that. And that's why we want to do this organizational readiness assessment as part of Phase Zero. And the final thing I'll say here is that organizational change management is typically on the critical path. In other words, it's resistance to change that elongates a project plan. So if we don't know what our change strategy is and how long it's going to take for our people to change, we don't have a realistic implementation plan. So in order for us to define a realistic implementation plan, which I'm going to come back to that point here in a minute, we need to understand what the change strategy is. Now, to learn more about change management and what it is and how it works, I encourage you to dive into this video right here. It's a detailed training video that I published on my YouTube channel that dives into organizational change management and some of the different components that you should be aware of. Or if you prefer to read more about change management, you can download our guide to organizational change management by scanning this QR code right here or via the links below. Now, once we have strategic alignment, we've defined our future state business processes, we've done the organizational assessment so that we can create a change strategy. Now we need to look at what the program management strategy is. How are we, the organization, not our outside consultants, but how are we, the organization, going to manage this project in the overall program? And when I say program, I mean not just the technical project, I mean the entire program. So yes, you're going to hire software vendors and implementation technical partners that will do the technical pieces of things. But you also need to have a change management team, a process improvement team, an architecture and data and integration team. You might have multiple technologies that you're deploying, so that might mean you have multiple technology projects that you're managing. That should all feed up into an overall program that you manage and you have a strategy for. In addition to having an overall program strategy and plan, you also want to make sure you have the right governance and controls in place, the right risk mitigation measures, the things that allow you to manage the project from a business and technology and people perspective, and also allows you to manage your third-party vendors as well. Now note that I'm not suggesting that your implementation technology partner do that for you. They can't do that for you. They can manage the technical work stream, but only you are well equipped to manage that entire program, and you should have that ownership within your organization. Now, my team here at Third Stage, we commonly will help clients
build out their program management capabilities and advise them along the way and really act as an extension of their program management team. But in general, you want to ultimately own that yourselves. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the difference between program management, project management, and how to structure an entire program, I encourage you to check out this video on my YouTube channel right here where I whiteboard out what a program is and how that's different from project management. Now, you may be wondering, why have we not talked about implementation planning? What's the actual implementation plan and why are we waiting this long to do it? First of all, I'll say that none of this is really sequential that I'm talking about. A lot of this will happen in parallel, but everything I've talked about so far in this video now should ultimately feed into and influence the overall implementation plan. And now that we know what the processes are going to look like and the magnitude of change with those processes and how well aligned we are as an organization, what our change strategy is, now that we know all that stuff, now we can create an implementation plan. Now you may also be wondering, well, my software vendor already gave me an implementation plan. Why would I do that now? Yes, they did give you an implementation plan as part of their proposal, most likely, but it's also highly, highly likely that it's unrealistic, doesn't have realistic assumptions, and doesn't fit your unique needs. And the other part of that is they probably just gave you a project plan for the technical work stream, not the overall program that includes the business process and the people aspects of the transformation. So for that reason, you need to take all these things we've talked about from phase zero and use that as a way to create the overall implementation plan, which can use the software vendor's implementation plan as an input, but you've got to add a lot of stuff to that, a lot of other activities that weren't included in their plan, and a lot of new assumptions that might be more realistic for your organization. Now, my final component of phase zero planning is the business case and the benefits realization plan. This is where you really refine and fine-tune the business value and the quantifiable business benefits you expect to get out of the project. It's where you refine the overall cost of the project because you probably didn't know what the real costs were until you went through this phase zero exercise. And it's where you also define what the business benefits are and the benefits realization plan. So we've talked about not just business benefits to justify the investment in the project, but we want to convert that business case into a benefits realization plan that has a detailed plan of how we're going to achieve those benefits, which modules or process improvements or job changes are going to enable that business value. And that's going to allow us to do two things. One is it's going to allow us to ensure that after we deploy new technology, we go back to that benefits realization plan and look at how we're doing and how we're tracking so that we can make improvements and optimize our implementation to maximize the value we get from our investment. But even shorter term and more fundamental is that during the implementation, that business case and benefits realization plan is going to help us make a lot of decisions that we might not otherwise be able to make. In other words, if we have questions around scope or whether or not we should customize or whether or not we should increase the budget of the project, we're going to be making that decision in a vacuum if we don't have a business case and benefits realization plan to go back to say, here's the business value that we do or don't get if we do or don't invest additional funds or additional time, additional modules, et cetera. So the business case and benefits realization plan is a great way to provide sort of the guardrails for the overall project to ensure that we have that North Star to make the right decisions that are going to add the most value to our organization. Now that we understand some of the major components of digital strategy, it's helpful to look at an actual case study of two different digital strategies and two different outcomes that we saw with two of our clients. And in this whiteboard session, what I do is I dive into what each of these two companies did and more importantly, what they did differently. What were the differences between how they pursued each of their digital strategies and what were the things that led one of those organizations to a successful transformation and what were the things that led the other organization into failure. And so this case study is meant to illustrate some of the things you should be doing and some of the things you shouldn't be doing. And it's also meant to illustrate some of the pitfalls and mistakes that organizations make when defining their digital strategy. One of the lessons I've learned over the years is that you can take two digital transformations that look very similar on paper, and you would expect that both of those digital transformations would have very similar outcomes. However, we often find that two similar transformations end up with very different results because of key decisions they make and key areas of focus and key things that they do differently throughout the project. So what I want to do today is unpack an example of two case studies, one successful client that we've worked with and one failure that we've worked with. Now on the surface, both of these companies are very similar. They're similar size, they're similar scope, similar complexity, similar internal dynamics, but yet they ended up with two very different results. So what I want to do is unpack how and why they ended up at different endpoints in their transformation journeys. Now, as I'm diving into these case studies here today, one point of reference that might also help you
is to look at our digital transformation report. It's an annual report we publish each year that highlights a number of best practices and lessons learned from helping clients through digital transformations over the years. So that's something you can read by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links in the description field below. So first, let's talk about each of these two companies on the surface and what these two companies are all about. Both of these companies that I'm going to talk about here today are for-profit, and as you'll see, they're very similar on the surface, but as we get into the details of what each of these companies did during their digital transformation, you'll see that despite their similarities, the way they executed their digital transformations were very different. So first, we'll start with the failure case study. This particular organization is a $15 billion utility, which means there's a lot of complexity in their operations, a lot of field services, a lot of crews that need to be managed, a lot of inventory, a lot of regulatory pressures, a lot of different dynamics that make this a complex organization. This organization also has about 30 locations throughout North America. They happen to be based in the North American region where I'm based. Our organization works globally, but this particular client is in North America. They have 30 locations, and most of their growth came through organic growth. And by the way, they have about 20,000 employees. So on the surface, large, complex organization, multiple locations, a lot of organic growth. Now on the successful case study side, what we're going to talk about here is a similar company, a little bit different but similar. It's a $20 billion organization, so still large, a little bit larger than this one. So strangely enough, larger organization, even more complex than this one, yet they're more successful than the failure. I'll come back as to why that is. $20 billion, roughly 40 business units throughout North America, and most of their growth has been through M&A, mergers and acquisitions. So in other words, they grew to this size primarily by going out and acquiring other organizations. And just as a side note, this organization had roughly 25,000 employees. So again, similar companies. This is actually a manufacturing organization, so slightly different industry. This is a utility, this is a manufacturer. So I'll clarify that here, that this is a manufacturing organization. They manufacture commodity products, raw materials for a lot of other manufacturers. And now the question becomes, how can two companies that look similar size, similar scope, similar complexity, how can two companies have such different outcomes and different results? So let's dive into the differences between these two companies in these two case studies, beginning with the digital strategy. What was the digital strategy that was defined by each of these organizations, and how are they different, and how did they lead to very different outcomes? Well, first of all, if we look at the digital strategy, the failure, the $15 billion utility, had a way or a process of deferring to one single ERP system. The reason this is important, and what I mean by deferring to one ERP system, is that they went out to market, they bought a tier 1 ERP system, and they just universally decided that that will be the one ERP system that is going to be used across the enterprise. But they didn't necessarily understand what the gaps were and what the weaknesses were with this model, especially given some of the complexities that we talked about here. First of all, they're a utility. They have a bunch of different locations. They've had a lot of organic growth over the years. And what they came to find, which I'll get to later, is that their ERP system couldn't handle a lot of that complexity, but they didn't do their due diligence early on to fully understand that. Now, the second thing that this organization did that was quite different than the successful case study is that they didn't have a clear vision for what they wanted from this digital transformation. In other words, this was just an ERP implementation. They didn't have a clear sense of what it was they wanted the digital transformation or the ERP software to do for their organization. So for this point, I'll just say that there was lack of clarity on what their strategy was. Another way to look at this is implementing an ERP system is not a strategy. It's a tactic to achieve a strategy, but if that becomes your strategy, that's a very weak strategy, and that's exactly what happened with this organization, is they said, we are going to deploy an ERP system, and that is our strategy. On the other hand, this organization went through something very different. First of all, they did not defer to one ERP system. They were strategic in selecting different types of technologies that would meet different needs throughout the organization. So we'll call this strategic use of technology. And then the other thing I'd say about this organization that's very different than the failure is that they were very clear about who they are as an organization in terms of both their strengths and weaknesses, as well as where they're headed as an organization. So they had a clear vision of where they were headed as an organization. So these two foundational differences are key reasons why one of these projects was successful and why one of them was a failure. And now I'll dive into some of the tactical things that happened within these strategies that further differentiated these two scenarios. So let's dive now into executive involvement. How did these two organizations act differently in their execution of the digital strategy as it relates to executive involvement? Well, starting with the failure, one thing that this organization did is they fully delegated the project to the PMO. PMO stands for Program Management. A lot of larger organizations have an internal PMO group that manages projects. And when I say they fully delegated the project, it may on the surface sound like, of course, the executives delegated the project. They need to do that to some degree, and I agree with that. But there's a fine line between delegating too much and delegating enough, but still having your hands involved where you need to. And in this case, the organization took very much a hands-off approach, and that's worth noting as well. So very hands-off in terms of how they managed the project. They didn't have clear expectations for the project. They didn't really get involved in any sort of significant decision-making as it relates to the digital transformation. And then the other thing that really haunted this project here is that the executives themselves were highly political and misaligned. And the reason this is so important is because this creates a significant headwind for an organization trying to go through transformation. If your executives are infighting, which they were in this case, there's a lot of infighting and backstabbing, and or they're not on the same page, they're not aligned, they're not headed in the right direction, that is going to create a lot of problems that trickle down throughout the organization and ultimately to the digital transformation. So this backdrop from an executive involvement perspective are very difficult for this organization. Now let's shift gears and look at the successful organization. This manufacturing organization had a very different level of executive involvement. They were hands-on involved. And when I say hands-on involvement, I don't mean micromanaging, I don't mean lack of trust. I mean they were involved in making key decisions around their business, improvements to their business operations that they wanted to pursue, scope changes, organizational changes. They were heavily involved in making those decisions and making sure they were all aligned before they moved too far down the path of a digital transformation. And then the other thing that gave this organization a lot of tailwinds instead of the headwinds that were experienced here is that the organization was very much aligned. The executive team was aligned. They just had a very common goal. Their culture was very strong, and they had a way of rowing in the same direction. So high degree of alignment. Now I'll stop here for a second and point out that this organization had the benefit of having this foundation in place before they started their digital transformation. This organization did not. One word of advice I would give to this organization is they should have spent more time on this line item right here before they started going down the path of further digital transformation. Without resolving this problem, these other work streams and these other things that might happen during a digital transformation were highly unlikely, if not impossible, to succeed within this organization. Now next, it helps to look at how each of these two organizations address their business processes as part of their overall digital transformation. The failed implementation really had a lack of understanding of what their current processes are and what they wanted their future processes to be. There just wasn't much documentation around current state or future state, nor did they think much about what they wanted their future state to be. So essentially, there was a lack of focus on current and future state business processes. And then the other thing that this organization did, which is very related to the fact that they didn't have a focus on their future state business processes, is that they deferred to the technology to tell them or help them decide how to run their business. And I'm not talking about just how to use a system or transactional levels of detail. I'm talking about material business processes and material business workflows. There wasn't a clear sense of what those future state processes were going to be. So this organization chose to just bring in the technology and hope and pray that the technology would determine for them what their future state business processes would be. So here there was too much deference or too much dependence on technology processes. Now what this did is this created a lack of clarity for the organization or for the project team as they're going through the digital transformation. They did not have a clear sense of what they wanted their business processes to be, and when it came time to deploy technology, the technologists, the implementers, did not have a good sense of how to deploy the technology, and they ended up choosing how to configure and build the technology just to fit what they thought was the right answer, which in most cases did not align with the direction of this organization. Now shifting gears and looking at the other example here, the successful organization took a very different path. Now, the thing I'll note here is that they didn't spend a lot of time going down in super granular detail defining a future state without understanding the technology strengths and limitations. But what they did do is more at a macro level, define what they knew they wanted their processes to be. They identified where they knew they wanted to improve their business processes. They may not have been sure how or what the individual detailed transactions would be, but they had a good overall sense and vision for what they wanted their business processes to be. Now, similar to this benefit here, or this advantage they had on the business process side, as far as having clearly defined processes, they also let the business drive the technological deployment rather than letting the technology drive the business changes. And this is really important. It's a very important nuance that a lot of organizations get hung up on. So the business drove the technology, the dog wagged the tail did not wag the dog in this case. Now again, the business drove the technology to a certain point, and then certainly once you got down into the granular levels of detail, the technology had to work within the confines of what it could or couldn't do. But in general, the overall blueprint for the business processes were very clearly defined, which not only ensured that there was an implementation that was aligned with expectations for business process improvements, but it also gave the project team a great deal of clarity in terms of how technology would be deployed. It ended up costing this organization less time and money than this one. Now, when we look at the organizational change or the people side of the equation, there was two very different scenarios in that regard as well. This particular organization, the failed organization, viewed training as the sole, one and only work stream within organizational change management. So there was an overdependency on training and a myopic view of organizational change management as simply being training. The other thing that was a challenge here is that the organizational change team, because of all the problems that had started earlier in the process and some of the problems that were created by these other misalignments that we talked about, is that the change management team was oftentimes working towards a moving target. Because there was so much chaos and change in direction and lack of clarity in some of these other work streams, change management activities were very difficult, and they had trouble getting traction because they themselves didn't fully understand what the changes were and what the impacts of the organization were, what the future state business processes were going to be, largely because the overall project team didn't understand that either. No one really understood what it was going to be. So that made the jobs of the organizational change team very difficult. So we'll just call this moving target. And then a third thing that's worth noting that I already mentioned is this misalignment that we saw at the executive level. That misalignment trickled down to the project team as well. So there's a high degree of misalignment across the organization as well. Now, if we shift gears and look at the successful organization, again, very stark contrast compared to the failure. This organization took a comprehensive view of change management. In other words, they didn't depend solely on training to enable the change. They looked at everything from the way the organization was going to be designed, how the IT organization would need to evolve to support the transformation and the post-implementation. They looked at what the change impacts were and how they could start communicating those changes. And another thing they did that was very important is that they baked change management into the overall leadership roles throughout the organization. In other words, they didn't rely solely on a separate change work stream or a separate change activity or team. They embedded change activities throughout the leadership of the organization. So the changes were leadership driven rather than change team driven. And then last but not least, the misalignment that this organization faced on the failure side, this organization had the opposite, which is a very aligned executive team, a very aligned project team, and a very strong culture ultimately that was driving a lot of that alignment. So alignment was an important backdrop that this change team and this organization was working from. So you can see two different scenarios from a change perspective as well. So one of the biggest contrasts between these two organizations is on the program and vendor management side. In other words, how each of these two organizations took ownership of the overall project and how they managed the overall project. Those are two very different scenarios. This organization, the failed organization, took sort of that outsourced mentality that they were going to let the vendors drive the project for them. And similar to being vendor driven, there was also a lack of ownership that came along with that, or a lack of internal ownership, I should say. And finally, the program management itself was focused on one work stream, primarily the technology work stream.
It did not include or have in the purview of program management some of these other work streams, change management or business process management, executive alignment, even just making sure there was strategic alignment, data, architecture, all the different work streams that go into a digital transformation. Looks like this, but this organization focused on one myopic view of the overall program. So it was very much a technology implementation versus an overall program. Now, on the other hand, this organization took a very different view of program management and vendor management. Here, the program management was driven by the client themselves, the organization. They drove the project and they managed the vendor very effectively. So in other words, they managed the vendors. The vendors did not manage them. This is a really important unhealthy dynamic that you typically see in other cases that you did not see here, which is most organizations, because they're not the experts, feel like they have to defer to the software vendors and the experts, the outside experts. In this case, they did leverage experts, including third stage and including the technology vendors, but they knew exactly how to manage those resources and those experts. They did not allow the project to get out of control, and it did not turn into an open checkbook as it did over here, because over here, the vendors were managing the project, and there's a lot of things happening within the project that benefited the vendor but did not benefit the client. That was not the case over here. In fact, just to give you a quick example, this organization here decided that they wanted to slow down the project and extend the timeline, not because they didn't want to be aggressive, but because they knew that the cultural changes and the operational changes they were trying to go through were going to take more time than the technology. So rather than just going at the same run rate for a longer period, they went to their vendors and said, we are going to throttle back and cut back the monthly run rate and extend the project. Vendors don't like that. Don't get me wrong. They do not like that because that hurts their revenue. It defers their revenue beyond what they'd like. But that was the right answer here. And that's exactly what this company did that was very different from this one. So they managed the vendors. They had very active ownership in the overall project. So there was no question as to what they were deploying or why they were deploying it. The business owned this overall project. So I've painted a picture of how these two transformations operated very differently. But what were the results? I've already given away the secret that this was a failure and this was not. This was a successful project. So let's start by focusing on what happened with the successful project, the one that I call the successful project. I don't want to say that this project was easy. There were no road bumps, there were no challenges, because there were road bumps and challenges along the way, a lot of pivots and changing directions that needed to happen. But this organization experienced a high ROI. They had control of their project. They were able to manage costs much better than the other organization. And ultimately, they got the business value they were looking for. They got a digital transformation that aligned with what they were trying to accomplish as a business, and they didn't spend an arm and a leg trying to get there. Too often, organizations spend way too much money with too little business value to show for it, but that was not the case with this organization. This organization, on the other hand, ended up in litigation. This organization was attempting to do the entire transformation in 3 years, and in 3 years, they got one location out of the 30 live on the system. And once that one location went live, it was a complete disaster, and that's when they stopped the project and sued each other. Basically, it turned into litigation, and then they hired third stage to be the expert witness in that case. So two very different results, but again, back to the top line here, which is on paper, they look like very similar companies. Other than being in slightly different industries, they're very similar size, scope, magnitude, complexity, their aversion to risk, their aversion to change. All the things were very similar on the surface, but the way they executed their digital strategies and their digital transformations could not have been much different.
Now that we've covered this case study to illustrate the difference between successful and unsuccessful digital strategies, it helps to talk about 10 pitfalls that organizations commonly fall into when defining their digital strategy. And these are the 10 biggest mistakes we see organizations make when they're defining those strategies. And these are the 10 biggest things that will lead to challenges and problems later in your digital transformation.
One of the biggest pitfalls that organizations fall into is bias. And what I mean by bias is you're biased for or against certain types of technologies, or you have biases or blind spots on how things should be done. And this is easy to fall into for a number of reasons. First of all, most organizations and their team members aren't super experienced in digital transformations, so they don't necessarily know what the objective view of the world is in the technology space. Secondly, and even more important, the other reason why bias is so common and so prevalent in the industry is because software vendors are biased. People trying to sell you technology and the related services are extremely biased. And each technological vendor out there has its own ecosystem of biased players that are out there intentionally trying to sell you software, which is understandable enough, but that focus on selling you software creates a certain amount of bias, and it creates blind spots into what the strengths and weaknesses are, objectively speaking, for each of the technological options you might have. So in order to overcome this bias, it's really important that you have agnostic and independent inputs into your strategy and planning process. Organizations like Third Stage Consulting that are unaffiliated with and independent from software vendors can be a great way to mitigate that sort of risk along the way. Similar to bias, unrealistic expectations is another cause for challenges and problems in digital transformations. And there's a number of reasons for this, almost too many to get into in this one video, but I'll highlight some of them here. One is that, like the last point on bias, most organizations haven't been through a lot of these digital transformations in the past, so they don't necessarily know how long an implementation is going to take, or how much it's going to cost, or how many resources are going to be required, or how great the risk might be. They don't really know. And then when you combine that dynamic with the fact that you have sales reps that are focused on trying to sell you the positive upside of using their software without necessarily showcasing the weaknesses and the risks and the downside of their product, those two things combined create a perfect storm that creates completely unrealistic expectations. And the reason these unrealistic expectations are such a problem is because people don't know what they're walking into, and organizations oftentimes go in with a view of how long it's going to take or how much it's going to cost or what the risks are, and they find that those costs, time durations, and risks are actually a lot higher than what they plan for, which causes them to fall into a number of pitfalls, which includes not having enough resources on the project, not budgeting enough time, not budgeting enough money. And that creates further downstream problems, which usually leads to cutting corners, cutting out scope, cutting key activities like change management, which I'll get to that later. So those are some of the challenges that come along with, or that are symptoms of, having unrealistic expectations. So similar to bias, you want someone that is independent and objective that can help you define a digital strategy and roadmap that's realistic and not just based on sales tactics and sales messaging. When it comes to evaluating potential technological options for your digital strategy, there's good news and bad news. The good news is there's a lot of options out there. You have tons of different ERP systems and CRM systems, human capital management, CRM, business intelligence, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all these different technological tools that you can be using to enable your digital transformation. In fact, there's so many that it can become overwhelming. It can be confusing, and it's hard to understand or find the product or products that give you 100% alignment with what you're looking for. And the reason for that too is because it doesn't exist. So the key is to really understand what the best options are for you and do so in a way that's objective and agnostic. And at the same time, you don't want to overanalyze and overthink what types of technologies you're looking for. So on one hand, yes, you have a lot of options out there, but a lot of those options you shouldn't even be considering because they're not good fits for your organization. So you really want to hone in and focus on the systems that are the best fit. And once you do that and you quickly get to a short list of options, you don't want to overthink it. You want to be thorough in your evaluation, but too many organizations get caught up in analysis paralysis. They take forever to make a decision. By the time they get ready to implement, the organization is already suffering from fatigue because it's taken so long and so much effort just to get to a decision. So to the extent that you can avoid this analysis paralysis, that's just going to help you execute on your digital strategy and roadmap much more effectively. Another challenge we see with digital strategies is that the digital strategies and the way they're planned and executed is misaligned with the overall corporate goals and objectives of the organization. So in other words, the organization is going this direction, but the digital strategy that's been defined is going that direction. And when you're diverging that way in two separate paths, you can see how that's going to create a recipe for disaster. And so it's important that you ensure that whatever digital strategy you define, whatever roadmap you've defined, is aligned with your high-level organizational goals, objectives, and priorities. Just to give you a quick example, if you're an organization that's trying to standardize your operations, you want to move to a common operating model. You want each of your locations to have a common set of business processes, a common platform to operate from, but yet your digital strategy defines a best-of-breed approach that looks at different systems and flexible systems that allow each location to have maximum flexibility. You can see how there's a misalignment there. It's not consistent with what the corporate goals and objectives are, what the overarching goals and objectives of the organization are. So it's really important that we define our digital strategy and roadmap in the context of what our corporate strategy is, and that we go through the process of validating and getting alignment between our digital strategy and our organizational strategy. Now, next on our list is a lack of internal alignment. And this is similar to the lack of strategic alignment, but more inwardly focused. So here's where we're focused on our key stakeholders and the people within the organization. Are they aligned as a team in terms of where we're going with our digital strategy? Back to the example I gave in the previous segment of the organization that wants to standardize, but they have a digital strategy that leads to a best-of-breed flexible model. If we take that same example and extend it here, we may find that certain stakeholders are on board with that standardized operating model, but then you have other key stakeholders and internal influencers that want that best-of-breed or that more flexible, localized model. Nothing wrong with that. It's human nature. We all can't think and act the same way, but we've got to figure that out, and we've got to reconcile those differences before we move forward too far in our digital transformation. So going through the exercise of making sure that internally we're aligned, and that internally we're aligned with the overall digital strategy, which then aligns with the overall organizational strategy, that's the next step and a really important pitfall that you can avoid by handling this step early in the process. Another common pitfall in how organizations sometimes will define their digital strategy is to not have a specific dedicated work stream that focuses on improving business processes prior to implementing technology. Too often organizations think that they're not going to have to worry about re-engineering processes because they're going to put in new technology that's going to handle the business process improvement for them. And while the technology may enable business process improvement, it's not going to tell you what you want to be when you grow up. So operationally and business process-wise, you need to define what your business processes are going to be so that you can build the technology around those business processes rather than assuming that the technology is going to give you the answer of what your processes should be. Now, system integrators and software vendors may tell you that they have best practices and standard business processes and workflows within their software. But the reality is today's enterprise technologies in general are extremely flexible. Even the most basic, mundane business processes have multiple variations. And if you don't have a clear vision of what it is you want to be operationally when you grow up, you're going to have a lot of trouble defining what the needs are for technology. So you want to spend that time up front defining your future state business processes, at least to a certain level, not down to the workflow transactional level, but to the point of being independent and technology agnostic. Once you get down into more granular level of detail, you can certainly wait until you have technology in place or until you're deploying technology to define those detailed workflows. But in terms of your general processes and workflows, you want to define those up front to avoid this pitfall. Just as many organizations wait too long to embark on the business process improvement work stream, many organizations also wait too long to start on the change management work stream. They may think that change is not going to be difficult for their organization, or they have to wait until they know what the technological design is going to look like before they can go through change management. And this is all very misguided. This is all stuff that is a mistake. You want to make sure you define your change management needs up front and start executing on your change strategy and plan as early as possible. And the reason for that is because even though you may think you're just deploying new technologies, you're not just deploying new technologies. You're deploying process changes, organizational changes, changes to job roles and responsibilities. You might be automating people's jobs. That's a lot to unpack and a lot to figure out, and it has a huge impact to humans within the organization. And this becomes even more true as technology advances faster and faster over time. That divide between what humans are capable of and what technology can do just continues to grow. So that leads to more impact to humans the more technology advances. So we have to figure this stuff out, and the thing that will most likely derail your project is not going to be the technology. It's more likely to be the people and the lack of human adoption that derails your project. So chances are, wherever you are in your digital transformation journey, it's definitely not too late to start your transformation, but it's also not too early to start as well. So be sure you start that change management workstream as soon as possible. Now, another challenge with digital strategies is not having the implementation methodology that's best for you as an organization. In other words, you defer to cookie cutter approaches or one size fits all approaches, which software vendors and system integrators are notorious for doing. They come in with their agile approach or their best practice industry focused approach, which you might want to take bits and pieces of what those methodologies are, but they may not fit your organization in totality. And so you want to make sure you tweak or modify the implementation methodologies that your software vendor and your system integrator might offer. Make sure you tailor it to fit your needs in your organization. I'll give you an example. A lot of software vendors now are promoting more of an agile approach to software deployments. Sounds good in theory, sounds like we're going to go faster, we're going to get this done cheaper. But what that also oftentimes leads to is it leads to a lack of clarity on what our future state is going to be. So back to the earlier example I gave of the company that wants to standardize their operations. If your stated goal is to standardize operations and to have a clearly defined common operating model, then an agile approach probably isn't the best approach for you. You probably want more of a waterfall-based approach, which is the traditional way of handling ERP implementations and enterprise software deployments, to where you can define your business processes and your requirements across the enterprise end-to-end process-wise, so that you can then figure out how technology can enable those business processes. Whereas an agile approach would just take little bits and pieces of your organization and your end-to-end processes and start to deploy technologies throughout the organization, which will likely lead to misalignment with that stated goal of standardizing operations. So that's just one example of how you want to make sure your implementation methodology is aligned with who you are as an organization and what it is you're trying to accomplish, as well as your culture, your tolerance for risk, and a host of other factors that need to be considered. Another big mistake that organizations make is that they confuse transformation with system integrator. They interchange those words. They think that the system integrator is going to do the transformation for them. Now, it's true that the system integrator or the implementation partner or the VAR that you work with is going to do a subset of your transformation, but the real transformation work comes from other work streams that the SI does not do. The SI is typically focused on designing, building, and deploying technology, but your transformation entails not only technology, but it also entails improving business processes. It includes or entails organizational changes and organizational improvements. So you can see right there how there's a disconnect between what an SI does and some of the other activities that need to happen. So you need to make sure that you have a comprehensive transformation plan. The system integrator's work is going to be one work stream within that plan, but you need to make sure you augment what they do with other activities like change management, like process improvement, the overall program management, and the project governance controls, the data migration, the system architecture, the integration of systems. All that stuff is stuff that the SI typically doesn't do or doesn't do well. So you don't want to confuse system integrators' work with transformation, because those are two different things. Although the SI is a subset of transformation, they're not one and the same. Now, last but not least is the failure to recognize risks. Too many organizations go through the process beginning with defining their digital strategy and roadmap, and they fail to recognize the risks that are inherent within their transformation. And to be clear, every organization, literally every organization that goes through a digital transformation has material risks that they need to consider and that they need to mitigate. So the key is, how do we anticipate and proactively identify those risks so that we can mitigate them before they become a problem, or before they derail the project, or before they become something that we can't overcome. And the problem is that most organizations and most project teams and even most technical and digital transformation consultants aren't good at recognizing risks ahead of time. They don't identify the risks in most cases until they start to feel the pain. They recognize the risk and the fire is burning out of control, and it's hard to contain, if not impossible to contain. So you need a very solid risk mitigation plan, a quality assurance framework that allows you to proactively identify those risks so that you can effectively manage those going forward and mitigate those going forward.
So now we've talked about what digital transformation is, what digital strategy is, what the different components are, some case studies of success versus failure, some of the pitfalls that you need to avoid in defining your digital strategy. And that's a lot of information. So what I want to do here is summarize everything we've talked about in this video, but do it in more of a keynote presentation format. So I want to play you a clip of a keynote presentation I gave at one of our conferences recently, where I unpacked this whole concept of digital strategy, and I try to simplify it for a broad audience, and I try to simplify it for the average layperson. And hopefully this reinforces a lot of what we've covered in this training so far, but also summarizes it for you so you can take that away to your team as well. So for those of you that don't know, again, my name's Eric. I've been married for 10 years, and I have two kids. I have two stepsons. They're both teenagers. They both play sports. One's 17 and one is 14. And September was sort of a rough month for the Kimberling household. At the beginning of September, our older son had a nagging knee injury. Didn't know what it was. It was sort of, he felt like it was a sprain or something like that. He hurt himself in football practice. And we find out he tore his ACL. So he has to, get ACL surgery in September. And he's 17, so he had been helping drive and helping. We certainly didn't need to drive him around anymore, but now we didn't have a driver to help take our younger son around. So we're already a man down at this point. And then about less than 2 weeks later, my wife complains that she's got really sharp stomach pain. So I take her to the emergency room on a Wednesday night at like 9:00. And they say, your appendix is about to burst, so you need your appendix removed. So she gets emergency appendicitis surgery. And, at first what I'm worried about is her well-being. And then you start to think, wait, who's going to take the kids to school in the morning? And who's going to take them to practice? And you start thinking about all the logistical stuff. So she's down at this point, and I'm doing a lot of the driving to get the kids to where they need to be. And then 2 days after her appendicitis, our younger son is playing in a football game, and he breaks his leg in 4 places. So he goes down. He gets emergency room treatment, and they reset his leg, all this stuff. So then you're thinking, okay, I'm the last person standing in this family. So I've got to figure a lot of stuff out. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. And it's amazing how much stuff I don't know and didn't know as a dad. One being how much my wife does to take care of everything in the household. So it gets to the point where, what time does school start? Where's your school? What school do you go? What grade are you in again? You start asking all these questions that the clueless dad would ask. And so there was a couple days of this, and then I started telling people. By the way, that it's been like I've been a single dad for weeks now, and my wife would remind me it's been 48 hours. Like, but it feels like weeks. In dad years, it's been like a month that I've been having to do this. So the reason I bring all this up is that it's a lot like digital transformations, right? There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of things happening. Hopefully, in your digital transformation, people aren't dropping like flies like they are in my household. But the whole idea with digital transformation is there's a lot of risk and things happen. And so what I want to talk about today is just how to navigate risk and how to develop strategies that make sense for your organization and will help you succeed and navigate some of those risks along the way. And I think what you'll find in this session here throughout today, and those of you staying through tomorrow as well, is that there's a lot of what we're going to focus on is the good, the bad, the ugly. We're not here to sugarcoat what digital transformation should look like. We're here to talk about what they really look like and what the messiness of it is. And it's not meant to scare you or tell you or make you think that you shouldn't go through a digital transformation. Instead, it's do your digital transformation, but do it with eyes wide open. And that's really what the point here and the theme is of this entire conference, is to have that tech agnostic view of how to navigate risks, not like my family's, but using that metaphor and analogy, the risks of digital transformations. So just a real quick overview of Third Stage Consulting. For those of you that don't know, we're tech agnostic, we're independent, we're not affiliated with any software vendors. We certainly have software vendors here today. We are not affiliated with them or any other software vendors. And that's our value proposition, and that will always be the core of who we are, is our tech independence and tech agnosticism. If that's a word. I don't think that's a word, but it is now. So that's our business model. And also the big part of what we focus on as an organization is the business and technology and the organizational components of transformation. So we're not tech consultants, I wouldn't say, but we are business consultants that help organizations through their tech initiatives. So a lot of what we focus on as an organization is not only software and application and tech related, but it's also related to process improvement, organizational change, and things of that nature. The third stage metaphor I actually stole from a rock and roll band called Boston. If you remember them from the late 70s, their third album was called Third Stage, and that whole album was a metaphor for the rocket launch idea that I stole from them. So definite rock and roll connection. Clearly, I'm a child of the 80s, which is why there's an 80s tribute band playing here later today. We work with a lot of different clients, a lot of different industries, a lot of manufacturing, distribution, food and beverage, government, financial services, some nonprofits as well. A lot of different types of organizations we work with throughout the world. We have offices in London for Europe, as well as in Australia for our Asia Pacific presence, and then also in Cape Town, South Africa for our African clients as well. So global team, global client base based here in North America, but we have team members throughout the world. My book is for sale. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today are themes that I pulled from the book here today. And so you can buy it if you want it electronically. You can scan the QR code or just go to thefinalcountdown.com. If you are also a child of the 80s, you might be picking up on this whole 80s theme here with the Final Countdown naming convention of the book. But you can buy it electronically on Amazon, or we've got hard copies for sale too if you like, and I'll sign it for you too if you'd like. So a lot of what we'll talk about today and the theme of this presentation is pulled from that book. So to start, I guess, let me ask you a question of the group here. How many of you are in the midst of a transformation already? You're already somewhere in the journey. Okay, maybe half of you roughly. How many of you are planning or thinking about or getting ready to start a transformation of some sort? Okay, very good. So maybe about half of you are already in the middle of it. A third of you are getting ready to start, and then the others, maybe you're not sure. And I'm curious, what are the other? What's the other category? What's the other option? But the whole reason I asked that is because digital transformation is a word that I love and hate at the same time. You know, I love it because it sounds cool and it's about technology. But on the other hand, it's so vague and broad and it has different meanings. And what does it really mean? And it's a little misleading too, because the word digital, I think, throws off the entire phrase because it gets you focused on the technology. And technology is certainly a part of it. And don't get me wrong, you're not going to do a digital transformation effectively in the long term without technology, and you're going to fall behind and you'll accumulate tech debt, all that stuff. I agree with that. But if you sort of lead with that mindset and lead with technology, that's where organizations tend to get into trouble. And part of the reason for that is because even if we do look at technology itself and focus on the technology aspect of transformation, we have to figure out, well, what is that? What does digital mean to us? What does technology mean to us? And what types of technology are going to be the best fit for us as an organization? And for some organizations, it might be that we're going to go out and we're going to find a single fully integrated ERP system. For others, it might be we're going to go do a more of a composable ERP or a best of breed where we go find multiple systems to address different needs within our organization. It could be that we're going to go deploy some sort of interoperability model. It could be that we're going to upgrade our current technologies and more incrementally move towards our journey. There's just a lot of different ways you can approach and tackle digital transformation. And there's a lot of different types of technologies you can use to enable your transformation. And so the word digital transformation is very broad, even just when we look at the technology piece of it. And then when you add on top of technology, the other components, the non-technology pieces, that's where digital transformation gets really complicated. That's where you start to incorporate the process improvements and the organizational change components of transformation. And those, in my opinion, are much more important than the technology aspect of it, the business process and the organizational side of it. And a lot of this all starts with having strategic alignment up front and understanding what it is we want to accomplish as an organization before we get too far into our transformation. What a lot of organizations do in terms of like organizational psychology that ends up happening a lot of times is that organizations will get enamored by a certain type of technology or a certain vendor, and they just put all their eggs in that basket and they go down that path without really backing up and looking at what are we really trying to do here and how could we selectively use technologies in different ways to give ourselves a competitive advantage. And I think a lot of this is because organizations just don't know, and there's a lot of options they get overwhelmed by, and that's why it's so important to really think through what it is you're trying to accomplish and be deliberate about how you're going to use technology to enable your transformation. So I want to cover a few themes from the book and also just themes of things to consider as you go through a digital transformation. And if you watch any of my YouTube videos or if you know me, a lot of times I say things that are semi-controversial or that people may not agree with. And it's also things that run counter to what the software industry has conditioned us all to think. And so being tech agnostic and independent, we don't have to worry about pissing anyone off, for lack of a better word, is because we're just here to help our clients. And so, you know, one of the things that a lot of organizations don't realize is that there is a dark side to cloud, the whole movement to cloud. And I'm not doubting that that's where we're going. We're going to the cloud, right? There's no real questioning that. I think the vendors have doubled down on it. It's where the tech industry is going. So there's not a question of is cloud here to stay, but I think the real question is what are the risks behind it? And we've been sold for about 10 or 15 years now, we've been sold this idea of all the benefits of cloud. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of benefits to cloud technologies, but there is also a dark side. And those are the things that a lot of times organizations don't realize. And the reason I bring up this and other risks and other blind spots that organizations have, again, is not to scare people, but to say there's a risk over here. We've got to look and see what we're going to do about that landmine that's right there. If we don't know it's there, we don't think about it, or we ignore it, we're probably going to step in it. And so in the case of cloud technology, a couple of things to be aware of is that a lot of times when you move to like a software as a service or a multi-tenant sort of a cloud solution, there's just a flexibility that you lose from what you might have had with your homegrown legacy system. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a fact, right? If you have this homegrown system, you've been using it for 30 years and you built it exactly how you wanted it, now you're going to move to a SaaS solution that has great functionality, might give you quantum leap improvements to your business, but you're losing some of the flexibility you had with your homegrown on-prem system. That's the risk, right? So what are we going to do about it? And that puts more pressure on the organizational change side of things, because now you're going to force your people to change more than you might change the technology. It's also going to put more pressure on your business processes, because now you've got to adapt your business to fit the software rather than the other way around. And again, that might be the right answer, and it probably is the right answer for a lot of you long term, and it might deliver the ROI to justify the risk, but we have to figure out what we're going to do to get there. How are we going to navigate the fact that we're going from this current environment we're in, now we're taking this massive leap to an entirely new technology, a new set of business processes? That's the sort of thing that organizations need to be aware of. And you really have to think through these things when you're planning for a digital strategy or a transformation and defining your strategy and roadmap for that transformation. You have to take that into account. So when a software vendor tells you that we can implement technology for you in 12 months or 6 months, whatever the number is, I have no doubt they probably can. But the question becomes, can you actually use that technology, and will it be adapted by your organization in a way that delivers business value? That's a different scenario than just deploying technology. And so we have to understand that risk and understand what that means, because what happens otherwise is we develop an unrealistic project plan, an unrealistic budget, we have unrealistic staffing and resourcing for the project, and then we get to some point in the project and realize that was never realistic to begin with, and now we're over budget, we're over time, we need to go back and ask for more money from the board. Those are kinds of conversations that are never pleasant, and they create a lot of problems. And potentially even worse, what happens is organizations start cutting stuff. They think, well, that budget was never realistic, that timeline was never realistic, we're not going to meet it. Let's cut change management. Let's cut a couple rounds of training. Let's cut a couple rounds of testing. Maybe we don't worry about cleaning up the data the way we wanted to, and you start making really bad decisions because you have to. And I'm not just talking about cloud when it comes to that, by the way. That's a dynamic you have to watch in general, because you want to be realistic about what the transformation is going to look like. And that's really the downside of cloud that we have to be aware of and that we have to be prepared for. Another thing to think about too with transformations, and this is a huge theme of the book, The Final Countdown, available for sale right out here. Shameless self-plug there. And I'll sign it for you too at no charge. There's organizational change. That is a theme you'll see throughout the entire book. It's a theme that I don't think it's possible for me to make a video or give a presentation without talking about change management. And organizational change is it's not important. It's something that's just a bare minimum ante to play the game. You have to do change management or else you will fail. One of the things that I do as a consultant, in addition to running Third Stage, is I'm an expert witness in a lot of lawsuits. In fact, that's how I met Taft Law, who's been a sponsor of the event for several years now, and Marcus Harris in particular, who's sitting right here. Hi, Marcus. If you ever get sued or need to sue someone, he's the guy you want to talk to. But one thing I found in doing expert witness work for Marcus and other attorneys is that every single digital transformation failure that gets to the lawsuit stage that I've been involved with, change management was one of the core problems in the project. And what we do in these expert witness cases too, by the way, is it's like a forensic analysis of everything that went wrong, the entire car crash. You have to reconstruct what happened in this whole train wreck. You read every email that was exchanged, every status report, every PowerPoint presentation, every steering committee update. You learn all this stuff about people that you just don't want to know, because you're reading their emails and you're seeing all the weird stuff that happens in organizations at times. So it's super fascinating. I feel like I could write a fiction or a semi-fiction book about all the weird stuff that I've learned or seen in these expert witness cases. But then I'd probably get sued, so I don't want to do that. Even though I have a great attorney over there with Marcus. But the change management thing is the one thing that I'll say is the number one theme for why projects fail. And so rather than talking about how change management's important, we should all do change management, I would change the narrative a bit and say it's just an absolute minimum ante. You have to do it. If you don't do it, then just don't do your transformation. That would be my advice. If you're going to invest super heavily in technology and you're not going to invest that much in change management, or you're not willing to shift some of your dollars and focus from technology over to the people side of the equation, then I would argue you should probably just not do a transformation. In fact, you'd probably be better off just doing incremental adjustments to your technology, but getting the processes right, getting your people up to speed and optimizing what you've got, you're probably going to get a much bigger ROI from that than the risk you take on from implementing technology without investing heavily in change management. So organizational change and also human capital management, just how you manage not only the digital transformation team, but your entire organization, how you manage them through the organization or through the transformation are both very critical. Another thing we're seeing is the mainstream adoption of AI and analytics. But what's super interesting about the year 2023 is this year was such a fascinating year in terms of ChatGPT and how it just took off in terms of like mainstream consumer adoption of a technology. It's really fascinating. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that, where it just almost literally overnight, people are talking about ChatGPT, and South Park is making episodes about ChatGPT, and it becomes part of the nomenclature. But I think that consumer adoption, I think ChatGPT in particular, whether or not that platform, is the long-term answer or not, is really irrelevant, because the impact ChatGPT has had on the industry is super fascinating. Because now we as consumers sort of understand AI in a way we never understood before now. But now it's sort of forcing the vendors and making enterprises that are hiring these vendors to do their technology initiatives, it's forcing them to focus on AI, because now it's top of mind for consumers and we as individuals understand it better. So now in our enterprise lives, we're looking for technologies that can leverage that sort of technology. So that's something that's super fascinating to think about. And AI is also fascinating because there's so much it can do that it can be overwhelming. And it's a good reminder that technology is changing a lot faster, and it's accelerating its pace of change much faster than any organization is going to be able to change. And so that chasm between humans' ability to change and technological change, that's going to continue to grow, especially with AI and analytics and some of this cool technology that's coming out. So again, back to the previous point, that's why change management becomes so important, is because now we're putting more strain than ever on organizations with this cool technology that will totally transform our business. But in the process of totally transforming our business, it will disrupt the people that are involved with it as well. So we just have to be mindful of the fact that, yes, again, there's a bright side. There's this state of utopia or nirvana we're trying to get to. But in the meantime, in that journey, what is it we're going to do with our people and with our organization to get us there? And so being selective and being deliberate about how are we going to use AI. And when we just define how we're going to use AI, how is it going to impact people's jobs? And then when we define how it's going to impact people's jobs, why are they going to freak out about it? And what are we going to do about it? And that's the way we have to think about it, is people will freak out about AI. They'll freak out about technological change and automation in general. Even though it could be a great thing for the organization, it's still, if it affects me personally in that way, it's going to be a threat to me. So that mainstream enterprise adoption of AI and analytics is another strong theme and trend that we're seeing in 2023 and certainly beyond. I think that'll be probably the big talking point for a lot of us in the space for years to come. Another thing that the ERP software vendors that are here today may want to plug their ears for this part of the conversation. They may not like this part, but there are a proliferation of alternatives to your traditional ERP systems. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I started in this space, you didn't really have a lot of options. You had, SAP and Oracle were around back then. Microsoft Dynamics hadn't really become a thing yet. Bond was still a thing, in the 90s. So you didn't have a lot of choices in the ERP space, and a lot of big organizations were going SAP, Oracle, Bond, and then there's sort of a drop off after that in terms of viable alternatives. And what you're seeing today is the total opposite. Now you've got SAP and Oracle, of course, you've got Microsoft, you've got Epicor, Infor, IFS, all who are here today. You've got other lesser known software vendors. There's a company called Priority Software out of Israel. I know they have some people here today that have joined us from Israel. A lot of different companies. Workday, for example, on the human capital side, and Salesforce on the CRM side. A lot of these niche players that have at one point were startup competitors, or 20 years ago they didn't exist, and now they've become big players in the space. And that the landscape, I think, will continue to change. And what it's doing is it's creating a lot of options for customers now. They don't have to go with the incumbent monolithic, old school type of ERP systems. They could, plenty of them still are, but there's a lot of other options now that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive too. It might be that you have a core ERP system, and then you've got other systems to do other things that your ERP system can't do very well. And you didn't really have that option before. You just sort of had to deal with it. You had to customize or do some sort of unpleasant bolt-on or whatever the case may be. So a lot of different options that organizations have now that they didn't have before. And so that proliferation of alternatives gives us a lot more different paths we can go down. And it makes digital strategy and planning even more important, because now we've got to be very deliberate about how we're deploying technologies. And even if we are, by the way, going to deploy an ERP system, for example, I'll pick on Epicor because they're here today. Where's Epicor? Right here. There's a couple of people from Epicor here, and Kristen in the back here. Let's just say you decide you're going to shortlist Epicor. What does that mean? I mean, Epicor has multiple products. How do we know which Epicor product is the right one? You look at like SAP. Even SAP, when I started in the space, I did a lot of SAP consulting because I worked at one of the big five at the time, big five consulting firms, and we focused on SAP. So when I was at that company, SAP was sort of its own homegrown, integrated system. But SAP has shifted its strategy now, and they went out and acquired a bunch of different other software companies like SuccessFactors and Ariba and Concur, Business Objects, et cetera, et cetera. So they become like a best of breed provider in one vendor. And so a lot of the vendors are recognizing this proliferation of alternatives, and they're acquiring other options and or developing multiple options. And so point being, the digital strategy, the planning, being deliberate about technology, finding the technology selectively that best fits your organization and your needs and your strategy, those are the things that are so critical to making your transformation more successful. The other thing to be aware of is that there are an increase in digital transformation failures. I see the trend ticking up pretty dramatically, and I'll be curious to hear from Marcus, who's up next after me. I know he'll touch on this as well, but some of the reasons why transformations are failing at a higher rate and are likely to continue to accelerate isn't because the technology is not good or because the technology can't do stuff. The technology can do more than we can ever imagine. And I have no doubt that the technology, for the most part, that's out there is pretty stable. It's proven in most cases. A lot of organizations are using these technologies successfully, but the journey to get there is becoming more and more complex and more difficult, partly because of what I described before, that chasm between technological change and human ability and organizational ability to change. That chasm is just going to continue to grow. And as that grows, the journey becomes bigger and harder and more complex and risky and costly and all that stuff. And our mindset needs to shift with that. And so in other words, we can't just drink the vendor Kool-Aid and say, okay, they're telling us we can do this in 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is. Maybe that's the right answer, but it's probably not. If a software vendor is telling you they can implement technology in a certain amount of time for a certain amount of effort, it's probably going to take you a lot more time than that, not because they're lying or because the technology can't do what they say it can do, although that is at times a risk that Marcus can opine on more than I probably can. That is a risk, but the bigger risk is that we as an organization can't change fast enough, and that becomes the critical path. How do we change our processes and our people to keep up with the technological change? That's what's driving a lot of failure. But the good news is if you address some of these blind spots and eliminate the blind spots, and you know what risk you're going into, that right there is a great starting point. Now you know what you're up against. Now you know that maybe it's not a 12-month implementation, maybe it's 18 months or 24 months. Or if it is a 12-month implementation, maybe the scope isn't as broad as we originally thought. And so being a little mindful and conservative, I'd say, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just being conservative and deliberate about how you plan for your projects is something that is going to help you make sure that you don't fall into that category of failures. And, I love Marcus, I love Taft Law, but I don't want you to have to hire him to go defend you or get involved in some sort of lawsuit. It's a lot cheaper to involve him or to hire companies like us and other speakers that are here. It's a lot cheaper to get that advice and that guidance up front than it is to go through a prolonged lawsuit. Another thing that's super fascinating about organizations and sort of the organizational psychology that happens with digital transformations is a lot of times organizations don't know what they don't know, which is okay. We don't expect that every organization is going to be an expert in transformation. That's why they hire companies like us and hire a lot of the people you're going to hear from here throughout the day and the conference. But what ends up happening is organizations tend to have this sort of a learned helplessness when they go through a transformation, meaning that they don't know what they don't know. And so they trust the first answer they get from a vendor or from any third party. And just to give you another, tying back my original opening story, tying it back to this point here, is that a real life example that's not technologically related, our son who broke his leg in 4 places,
It was a really bad injury, and it was kind of a freak injury too, which is super weird. No contact, it was artificial turf, blah, blah, blah. I won't get into the details, but one thing is the doctor reset his leg and said it should heal on its own. The body will do its thing and the bone will heal. In 4 months, he should be up and around and doing stuff again. And then we thought that seems a little odd because, he just shattered his leg. We saw the x-rays and it was mangled. I mean, you could see it. His leg was mangled. And so we just thought it was weird. So we went to another doctor who said the opposite. They said, no, you need surgery like right away. That's not going to grow well. He's got growth plates that are exposed. He fractured his growth plate. They were concerned about that. And they were worried that there are shards of bone in there too. And they said, you absolutely need surgery. There's no way you should just let that heal on its own. So two very conflicting experts telling us two totally different things. And so we, as parents, had to take ownership of this. We had to dig deeper into both arguments and understand, first of all, the economic self-interest. That was one thing we learned very quickly. The surgeons, of course, were all saying, get surgery now. The doctors who are more into physical therapy and recovery type stuff were saying, don't worry about surgery, just get him recovering now that we've reduced or reset his leg. And so, we had to do a lot of research. We ultimately decided to get surgery. And it turns out that was probably the right decision because they did find a bunch of bone shards that didn't show up in the x-rays and the scans. And that was causing some tendon issues, or they speculated it was causing some issues already, which is his toes were curled up and stuff. It was kind of gruesome, too much information there. But the reason I bring this all up is we had to do our own due diligence. And it's a lot like that with digital transformations. You, as people and leaders within your organizations and stewards of your resources and that sort of thing, you have to protect your own self-interest and you have to ask the tough questions. And, it's fine to trust the experts. It's fine to bring in experts. You certainly want to listen to outside voices. But at some point, you've got to look at yourself, look at the information you're getting, and make decisions for yourself. We have one client who, it's a big steel company that's a client of ours, and we've been working with them for several years now. And they had a couple big projects happening at once. They were implementing Oracle and SAP in different parts of the organization. They were that big that they could get away with that sort of best of breed model. But one thing they found is that the technology work stream was moving a lot faster than the people in the process work stream. And they took the most dramatic actions that I've ever seen a client take, in that they said, all right, we're running at this run rate of X amount of dollars per month, and we were assuming it was going to be this duration. We're actually going to stretch that out now because we're finding that this duration was never realistic. We're spinning our wheels with the staffing that we've got right now under the assumption that we're going to get to that unrealistic timeline. And so what they did was they went to their big system integrator and said, we are cutting your staff. We're cutting it in half. We're going to stretch this out by, I can't even remember how much time they added to the project. Point being is they took total control of the project, and the system integrator did not like it because it worked against their self-interest. Now, suddenly they had to cut their staff. They weren't making as much revenue right now. They had to spread that revenue out. So it conflicted with their self-interest, but the client knew best. They knew that this wasn't going to go well. They're wasting time and money trying to get to an unrealistic timeline. And so it's a great example and a good reminder that you as organizations need to protect your best interests, and you don't want to defer and completely outsource your project, which is what a lot of, especially big organizations, I'd say bigger organizations are more at risk of hiring a big consulting firm to come in and just do the whole thing for them. And that is super risky. It's going to cost you a ton of money, and it's probably not going to go well. I haven't seen that outsourced model work in any situation in my career. And I've worked with a lot of different organizations over 25 years. And the organizations that are most successful, even if they don't make perfect decisions, even if they make bad decisions at times, the most successful organizations are the ones that make strong decisions based on their needs and what they think is best for their organization. And there's times where we disagree too. We'll tell them, we don't think that's a good idea. We think you should do something different. And sometimes they'll tell us, okay, we appreciate that, but we're going to do whatever. And that's what you have to do. And that's okay. Our feelings don't get hurt when a client doesn't listen to us. And the same should be true for the rest of the industry too. And it really doesn't matter what we think anyway. What matters is this is your organization and you need to protect your interests. So this is my Tony Robbins motivational attempt here to say, take control of your project. Don't let other people tell you how to run it. All this being said, strategy is more important than ever. Digital strategy has always been important, but defining a clear path to how you're going to get to that third stage of success and to that end state that you're trying to get to is more important than ever, especially because of all the things I've just talked about. The fact that technology is proliferating, technology is changing faster than we can imagine, change is hard to begin with, but it's a lot harder now than it was before, and it's becoming harder over time. A lot of times, as a side note, a lot of times organizations will say to us, we're not worried about change management with our people because they're excited for the change. They know these old systems suck. They know that there's a better way they could be doing their jobs. And I don't disagree with that. Most organizations say that and they mean it, and it's true. The problem is that when you dig into and start deploying the changes and you start disrupting people's lives, suddenly it's not so fun. Suddenly I'm not so excited about the change. You start talking about AI or whatever and how it's going to automate 50% of my job. Sounds good in theory. I can get behind why you'd want to automate 50% of my job, but wait, what's going to happen to my 50% of my job? You're going to automate it. Do I still have a job? What am I going to do with that 50% of the time? What about that value I provided the organization of working through all these bad systems? That's the pride I take in my job, and now you're taking that away from me. That's the sort of thing you have to think about. And so all these dimensions that we're talking about mean that strategy is more important than ever. Digital strategy will always be important, and will continue to be more important. And I always tell organizations too that if you can go slow at the beginning, that's when you want to go slow. When you're planning, when you're doing your strategy, you don't want to get into analysis paralysis. That there's a difference between analysis paralysis and spinning your wheels and just being stuck versus let's go slow and let's do this at a measured pace to have a really solid plan. Let's re-engineer our processes and define our roadmap and figure out how we're going to integrate the systems, figure out how we're going to resource the project. Let's do that part slow so that later we can speed up. And if you do that, it may feel like you're going slower and you are falling behind against what you could be doing in that early stage. But long-term, you will complete your project faster and more successfully if you take that time up front to define the strategy, the roadmap, do the project planning. Those organizations that take the time to do that, again, they fall behind because they aren't starting the project right away. And the vendor's telling you, by the way, vendors will typically tell you, you need to start now. We're going to get our team out there on Monday. We're going to start designing and building stuff. It's going to be great. We can't wait another week. We can't wait another month because then we'll fall behind. That's not true. You need to fall behind early on to take that time to get it right. And then you can speed things up later. And it's going to go a lot faster if you have your ducks in a row and you have all that figured out. By the way, too, back to my previous point about taking ownership of the project, the more time you take to define a strategy and plan, the more likely it is you're going to take ownership and have control of your project. And it's going to be less likely that you either intentionally give up control to your vendor or you unintentionally cede control to your software vendor or your system integrator. So the more time you take doing this, there's a lot of secondary benefits as well to make your project more successful. Accountability and risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is something that's always been important, but I think now organizations are finally starting to recognize that it is very important to talk about risk. And I know Marcus will touch on that in the next session from a legal perspective, some of the risks to be aware of and to watch for and be mindful of. But I'll summarize this real quickly in the interest of time by saying that risk mitigation and risk management is something you want to do from day one. And if you're going into a project without a risk assessment or a risk log that's empty, something's not right. There are risks, absolutely. In every single project in here, I guarantee there are risks with your project. I'm not saying you should stop your project and cancel it and just don't do it. I'm saying there's a risk there. You just don't know what it is or no one's said anything about it yet. And we've got to figure out now how to address it. Problem with digital transformations too is that risks oftentimes aren't obvious up front and they percolate and they just sort of sit there under the surface until you get closer to go live. And the closer you get to go live, the more the stuff starts to bubble up. And by the time the stuff bubbles up, it's too late. That stuff's been brewing for months or years leading up to that point. And that's why a lot of times organizations feel like they just got sideswiped or they just got derailed on their project overnight. It didn't happen overnight. That stuff was percolating over time. So that's why you want to identify those risks early on and start attacking the risk and being deliberate about it. Another 80s reference, for those of you that grew up in the 80s, you remember the whack-a-mole game where you had to hit the mole and then the next one pops up, you hit that one, another one pops up and you hit as many as you can. That's risk mitigation and that's a digital transformation. Those are your risks right there, the moles that keep popping up and you just got to keep beating them down. And might not be quite as fun as whack-a-mole, but that is something you need to do in a digital transformation to be successful. If there's one biased thing I'll say here in today's conversation, it's that I think the acceleration of the tech agnostic movement is something that's going to continue to accelerate. And I don't just say that in a self-serving way, although I'll be honest, there is a self-serving piece of why I'm saying this. But I will say, even if it's not third stage, I will say that the tech agnostic movement is going to become more and more powerful and more important to this industry, because you need people that don't have economic interests that conflict with your own. And that's the way the whole industry has been built around competing and conflicting self-interest. And that's okay. That's just the way it is, right? If a software industry wants to sell software, they need to have their marketing messaging down. They need to build an entire ecosystem that supports that sales message. They need to hire consultants that focus just on their software and get commissioned to sell their software. They need to pay for industry analysts to talk about how great their software is. That's the way you sell software. So that's not going to change too, by the way, whether you like it or not, it's not going to change. So let's not worry about changing that. Let's figure out what we're going to do about it. How are we going to add a dose of reality and objectivity to our project? And one way to do that is look to voices that don't have a vested self-interest that conflicts with yours. We only make money from our services from our clients. We don't make money from software vendors. And that's a really important part of our business model. And that tech agnostic mindset, I think, will become more and more important, not just for us, but for other organizations going forward. And I know several of the speakers here today, most of the speakers here today are tech agnostic and may touch on that as well. So I'll step out of the way here. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to put a bow on all this and sort of give you a capstone here, this is a digital strategy roadmap that we have a lot more detail behind this. This is a summary of it. Feel free to take pictures and I'll send it to you. We're pretty open with our general methodologies because it's not rocket science. Despite the third stage metaphor that I talked about before, digital transformations are not rocket science. They don't need to be that complicated. They just need a focus on the right things. And this digital strategy roadmap really hones in on the major threads that are really important. And certainly enterprise applications here are very important. So going and finding the right technology, that's important. Having the right solution architecture from a technical perspective and an infrastructure perspective is important. Making sure you've got all the technological stuff figured out, how data is going to work and how data is going to flow, how processes are going to flow, how integration is going to work, what types of technologies you'll tie together, all that stuff. This is all important, but the most important part of a project is going to be these areas here, your overall business process management and your organizational change. And even backing up even further, if I were to simplify it in one thing that is most important, is to make sure that this roadmap that you define for your organization fits who you are today and who you're trying to be in the future. And that will look very different than anyone else you ask in this room. And it should look different. Not to say you should recreate the wheel, not to say you should over-engineer your project, but to say that the way you use technologies, the way you deploy changes, the way you change your culture, the way you change your people, that should be a lot different than what most organizations do. You might use a lot of the same tools and best practices, but it should, for the most part, look different. So create a digital strategy that fits your style and your business and your needs and your priorities and objectives. And yes, you can listen to the tech providers that'll tell you all about all the great bells and whistles that are out there and the great options that are out there. Certainly take that into advisement. But at the end of the day, it's like a puzzle. You've got to put together the pieces of the puzzle that make sense for your organization. And by the way, who you are today is really important. A lot of times in this industry, we tend to say, don't worry about today because you're changing. That doesn't matter. It's old school. You're going to the future. Well, you do have to understand today because your entire organization was built to get to where you are today. And where you are today and where you're starting from looks different from where other organizations are starting. You have to think about it too, by the way, is this digital strategy for us? Is this going to be an incremental change? Like, are we just going to do some minor low risk, but maybe high ROI types of changes? Are we going to do more of a quantum leap where we're going to just double down on technology and we're going to be really aggressive about how we go through the transformation? Those are two totally different strategies and roadmaps, and neither one, by the way, is right or wrong.
So there you have it. That's the intro to digital strategy. I hope this has given you a good foundation to start from. I hope it's given you some ideas and things to think about as you define your digital strategy and start to execute your digital transformation. If you'd like to learn more about digital strategy and some of the things you need to know to inform your digital strategy in 2025 and beyond, I encourage you to read our annual digital transformation report. It's a report we publish each year. It contains a number of digital transformation best practices, independent software reviews and rankings, and benchmarks to help you understand what's going on in the market as it relates to digital transformation and ERP projects. You can read that report by scanning the QR code right here in front of you, or you can go to the links below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.